Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's now 9:30 and time for me to open this hearing. My name is Melvin Middleton. I'm an economist and a Chartered Town Planner, and I've been appointed by the Secretary of State to hold this examination into the Welwyn Hatfield Local Plan and to prepare a report on the DPD's soundness for the Council. You should all have received a letter from the Programme Officer with a copy of my examination procedural note, virtual hearing participation note, together with an agenda. I will assume that you have all read and familiarised yourself with the contents of these documents and therefore dispense with the full introduction and take most of it as read. However, before I get to the matters of the hearing itself, there are some housekeeping items that I need to deal with first. If you have any queries about the examination other than in response to what I'm about to say, please contact my Programme Officer, Louise St. John Howe, whose details you should all have. Also, it is not appropriate to hand in material at a virtual hearing. That should already have been sent to the Programme Officer for prior distribution. All material that we will refer to or discuss today should be on the examination website. If it is not, then please do not refer to it. Any new material submitted to Louise after this event should only be following a specific request from myself, unless there are exceptional reasons. An agenda for the event was sent out subsequent to the invitations and was also posted on the website. I presume that everyone has a copy, but if not, please let me know now. Does anyone have any issues about the form of the agenda? I will leave the event and guide the proceedings.
So sorry, I've had my hand up there.
I'm sorry, I'm not
Not at all.
Mr. Simons.
Hello, sir. Nice to see you. Zach Simons, sir. As you'll appreciate, or might not appreciate, I appear for Tarmac, the promoter of the site, in the shoes of Mr. Marici. I've just got an initial headline pointer on the agenda that'll just take a minute to outline, and it's because it arises before we get into things like neighbourhood facilities or the need for a school. We say it's an important headline point that goes to the overall scale of the allocation. If I just spend 30 seconds telling you what it is, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. It arises because our position on points A to F in the agenda that we'll come to in a mo depends on, we say, the outcome of this initial sort of headline point. And you'll remember, sir, that your interim conclusions on this site way back when in last year were that you'd be unlikely to find exceptional circumstances to release the land to the south, as you'll remember, because it might not be as sustainable as alternatives that could be offered up as substitutes. See para 74 of your findings of October of last year. Now, since then, of course, as you know very well, sir, and I've seen some of the hearings on YouTube that have been posted, a number of things have happened since then. Council's position on the phone has changed, and obviously you've had a hearing on that. It no longer, as you know, seeks to support the Simonside new village, originally allocated for over 1,100 homes. And of course, as you also know, it now relies on land adjoining Potter's Bar, this PB1 site, which you've indicated in December of last year can't be sound or taken any further. Now, we're not going into the detail of any of that stuff now, but the point about it is that there's been some very substantial changes in circumstances since your initial your interim conclusions. The terms of the debate on exceptional circumstances have, well, I mean, they've shifted. We'd say, I think they've shifted actually very considerably, which means that what we say, so the headline point is that now that we're back on this site, it's a reasonable time for you to revisit your interim conclusions on the acceptability of the strategic allocation as a whole, as originally submitted to the Secretary of State for examination, because the council was given a fair warning by you, sir, to come up with some suitable, alternative ways of dealing with the extra 500 to 600 units from the southern portion of this site, but they've not done it. And the real context for you, sir, is as you know very well, because you've done several hearings on this site already. For many years, this site's been planned as an integrated, cohesive whole, taken together with the portion of the site in the now adopted East Herts plan, which, as you'll remember, that allocates 1,350 homes on that side of the line, on the basis that it can be delivered in a comprehensive way. And we say that that there's a really important public interest in securing a cohesive and joined up approach to plan making over local authority boundaries, particularly for this sort of integrated strategic proposal for an extension. So in a nutshell, what we say is that now is the time, or a reasonable time, to revisit the soundness of the full allocation, not only the reduced allocation that the council are putting forward. And in addition to that, so we say that there's two more things you should be considering at the same time. Those are these, including the entire site in the allocation, but making clear, if this is what you think in the text, that the southern area, if this is what you think that the 1200 can't be brought forward, that the 1200, the southern area of the sites where there should be things like screening, boundary strengthening, landscaping proposals, or whatever you think is appropriate, but including the entire site in the allocation, and or at the same time designating the southern portion of the site as safeguarded land, but releasing all of it from the green belt. Because whatever happens, at the very least, this council is going to need to be in a position to have flexibility on meeting whatever its number ends up being, sir. And I'm obviously not going nowhere near that debate today, but it's going to need flexibility on meeting its number over the course of the plan period. So that was, thank you for letting me take you through that, but that was it in terms of our initial headline.
Okay, is that, if you like, the sum total of what you wish to say on your initial headline, or are you wanting it to be discussed under the agenda?
That it goes to the agenda, sir, because so if that's all I wanted to say on my initial headline. If you say, sir, that yes, actually that's a fair point, and yet this would be a reasonable time to consider the 1200 along with the 600 that the council is now proposing, that'll affect each of the individual. So when we get to things like, you know, the boundary, say later on, when we get to the extent of built development, the school, all of those things, it's sort of contingent on what you might want to do, sir. I suppose if you don't want to reach a decision on it now for understandable reasons, you might want to say, as we go through each agenda item, you might want to ask the parties, the council or me, how would my conclusions on this change? Would they change or whatever? How would it be affected if in the end I thought I reconsidered my view on the exceptional circumstances for the 1200? Then at least you've got the full picture one way or the other, and you can go away and reflect on it, sir.
I mean, I think as far as, if you like, what would happen if the whole site was to be examined, was to be allocated, we've really been there, and it's absolutely pretty clear in my mind what would be happening vis-a-vis the sorts of uses, you know, for example, whether there would be a local centre in,
sure,
it wouldn't be, whether there'd be a school or they wouldn't be. So I'm not sure I want to hear any more about that
fair enough, sir,
unless things have abruptly changed. On the 2 points that you raised, as far as safeguarded land's been, we've been through that before. We've examined that sort of concept in the part of the Greenbelt. The council were opposed to having safeguarded land, and as far as I'm concerned, I put it to bed. That's the end of it. There may well be extenuating circumstances, and that really probably applies to everything you're saying. And I don't think we've got there yet. Yes, if I'm unable to come to a satisfactory conclusion with the council vis-a-vis whatever the site requirements are following the reappraisal of the objective assessed housing need, then I've really got to think what I do with it. And certainly you can rest assured I wouldn't find the plan unsound without looking at other options, and this could be another option. But I think that is something, you know, that we're not at yet, and you know, just really have to see what happens.
Thank you, sir. Noted.
Okay. So back to where I was. I'll lead the events and guide the proceedings, inviting particular people to speak to the matters as we proceed through the agenda. You should not attempt to speak unless you're invited to. If you wish to speak on a particular matter, please use the hand facility on the toolbar to notify me, and I will invite you to join the discussion at an appropriate time. For the benefit of third parties watching, the first time that you speak, could you please state your name and, if applicable, whom you're representing? When you finish speaking, the programme officer will turn off the hand facility for you, but please remember to turn off your microphone yourself when you finish speaking. That helps to reduce static interference when other people are speaking, and we'll have a much more audible hearing than we otherwise might have. Also, for the benefit of third parties who may be watching this event, when you refer to documents, would you please refer to them using their full title and examination reference number rather than by some abbreviation or acronym? As well as the council, I understand the following persons are participating in this session. Concerning SDS2, Birchall Gardens Summer Birchall Garden Suburb and SDS1 Panzanger. The council are represented by Wayne Beglan, Sue Tiley and Simon Thornley. And the county council have got Anthony Collier in attendance for highway matters and Anthony Proietti in relation to education. On Birchall Garden Suburbs, Mr. Ian Davies is representing Central Hearts Green Corridor. Mr. John Boyd and Miss Michelle Bolger are representing Gascoigne Cecil. And Mr. Simons and Mr. Winterskill are representing Tarmac. When we get to the second item later this morning, which is Panzanger, the council and county council officials are the same. Mrs. Jane Quinton is representing herself and local residents. Mr. David Jobbins is representing Homes England, and Mr. Jane Osborne and Mr. Edward Briggs are representing Mr. J. Barton. Have I left anyone out? Good. This session will examine the council's proposed revisions to the policy criteria affecting site SDS2 and SDS1, southeast and northeast of Welwyn Garden City separately, and we will do it in the reverse order, and that is Birchall Garden Suburb first and Panzanger second. Persons not involved in the northeast Welwyn Garden City discussion are free to log out and leave the hearing after the conclusion of the first item. Also, could I ask you not to only to desist from speaking about a particular site when the hearing is specifically discussing the other site, but within each of the discussions, please raise the points in accordance with their appearance on the agenda as far as that's possible. Can you make sure that you're free of usual distractions as usual? I'll take a short comfort break, probably around about 11 o'clock, if not before. I'll break for lunch and conclude this session around 12:45, again, if it's not done before. I'll be resuming about 1400 for this afternoon, so persons that are participating in this afternoon session, please don't log out. I've already visited both of the sites a number of times, most recently in the early part of this week, but I may revisit them to look specifically at some of the matters that arise from the discussions. If any of you want me to specifically look at an aspect of any of the sites, would you raise it today, please? And also pass the details on to the Borough Council before the end of March. I'd ask the council, as before, to coordinate the points to be looked at on a site-by-site basis and arrange some sort of itinerary for me to go around looking at them. In line with national policy, my starting point for the examination is the assumption that the council has submitted what it considers to be a sound plan. Those seeking changes must demonstrate why it is unsound by reference to the tests of soundness. I made observations about both of these sites and following the previous hearings and issued an interim report in October 2020 when I discussed both sites at length and outlined possible ways forward. The council has responded to those, and it's those responses that we're here to discuss today, not the matters that led to the conclusions in the interim report or previously. If you consider an aspect of the council's proposed revisions to the policy criteria to be unsound, I and the council need to know why it is unsound and the precise changes to the wording required in order, in your opinion, to make it sound. Please remember that soundness in the context of allocations does not mean the best or the most appropriate solution. It means that the proposal passes all of the 4 tests of soundness at paragraph 182 of the National Planning Policy Framework 2012. I must stress at this point that in order to obtain a change in the allocation itself or in the policy considerations, you must first of all demonstrate why what is now being put forward by the council is unsound. And secondly, put forward a suggested change in policy wording that would make it sound. Any proposed main modifications will require consultation and may require further sustainability appraisal. As you know, at the end of the examination, I will produce a report which will recommend main modifications that are required to make the plan sound. I would remind you that this plan is still being examined using the guidance set out in the National Planning Policy Framework document that was issued at the end of March 2012. I will refer to it as the framework. Therefore, your observations should be based on that guidance and not the 28 guidance. You'll be surprised at the number of people who still refer to the 28 guidance, despite me repeatedly saying this. It's supported by the National Planning Policy Practice Guidance, which is an electronic document on the government's website that is continuously updated. I've already read the evidence submitted by the respondents and the council. This means that in our discussions, you do not need to repeat your case to me verbatim or to give me any sort of formal presentation. As I've intimated, it would be helpful to me if the discussion is broken down into the component parts as set out in the agenda. We'll therefore go through each item on the agenda in order. I'll welcome relevant participation through observations, comments and questions from any of you involved in each item as the discussion progresses. Turn on the hand facility to attract my attention if you wish to say something. Please note that unless I specifically agree to it, there will be no cross-examination, but putting questions to the opposing parties during the discussion by myself is perfectly acceptable. I'll take part in the discussion as well as chairing it. On a more general point, please remember that my job is to challenge the soundness of the entire plan and not just those parts about which there have been representations from third parties. I also have to write a comprehensive report that fully explains why certain aspects of the plan have needed to be changed to make them sound, while other parts of the plan are considered sound by me and do not require change, despite the representations against them. In order to do this, I need to equip myself with a comprehensive set of evidence that has been tested and justifies my conclusions. You must remember that in some instances, I will act as devil's advocate in order to test the robustness of parts of the assessment that other people are not questioning. In some instances, I will not necessarily be expressing my own opinions. Sometimes I will be specifically expressing the views of third parties who have chosen not to be present. And again, these may not necessarily be my opinions. If the session is not to be excessively prolonged, then it is essential that it remains focused on the remaining considerations that affect its soundness. I'll therefore interrupt participants who appear to me to be going off message. I hope politely, but as I come from a different part of Britain than most of you and where people's language is perhaps more blunt, please do not take offence at anything I say, none will be intended. Are there any questions at this stage about how the hearing is going to be run? Okay, then I'll turn to the hearing. As I said, first item is going to be policy SB19, SDS2 southeast of Welwyn Garden City, more appropriately known as Birchill Gardens suburb. Item A is about neighbourhood facilities. There's obviously, on the basis of the site as it is now proposed by me to be in the plan, an issue as to whether or not neighbourhood facilities of any description are feasible or not. And if some are, to what extent are they feasible? And you know, the other issue around it, to what extent should it be grouped together with, let's say, non-shopping facilities, assuming that there are going to be non-shopping facilities? So who would like to kick off? Do you wish to say what the council's view position is, Ms. Tiley?
I'm going to ask Mr. Thornley to lead on this particular item.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thornley?
Thank you, sir. Yes, our view is that a site of an edge of town site of about 600 or so dwellings is unlikely to be able to support a new shopping facilities as part of its development. Whilst that might be feasible in a standalone new settlement of that scale, it's on the kind of on the margins. Certainly where you have access to town centre shopping, outer centre shopping and nearby relatively close local shopping facilities, we don't think it's likely to be supported economically, if you like. So our view is that with the reduced scale we're not expecting to see and not going to be seeking, wouldn't seek new shopping facilities. We have incorporated, I think with the agreement of Tarmac, a new community hub, which is a sort of community facility rather than a commercial one, or rather than a retail one per se, within the site close to the green corridor. Our view is that is viable potentially and achievable and beneficial to this new community. And as I say, I think Tarmac have confirmed in their statement that they're happy with that approach and its broad location. So yeah, no shopping, but we are happy with a small, probably a relatively small community facility on the site. There have been suggestions that this change has an impact on the sustainability appraisal in one or two of the statements. And I just wanted to address that, if I may, because it might save some time. If you look at the sustainability appraisal, and that's reference SA/6, whilst the sustainability appraisal text does refer to the potential for local centre and shopping to be provided, I think if you look at it, it's fairly clear that that doesn't actually affect the score, which is a single plus. The score is primarily or essentially based on the access to existing facilities, because as I understand the approach that LUC have taken, they've generally done an unmitigated score, and including facilities within a site would be considered mitigation. So it's based on access to existing facilities, which are, slightly under a mile walk, I think, from this, or slightly under a mile walk from this site. Hence, it gets a single plus. So this doesn't affect the SA for the sustainability appraisal for the site.
When you said community hub, does community hub mean what it actually says, community facilities, meeting places, etc., or does it go beyond that?
It's primarily going to be I would imagine, a community hall of some kind, of a scale appropriate to the site. I think Tarmac, in their discussions with us previously, were of the view that there could be some potential cafe stroke retail, those kind of facilities associated with it, or working out of it. Some community halls obviously have bars and those kind of facilities, a social club type set up. But essentially, we're talking about a community hall which may, subject to the economics of it, have other facilities associated, but
Okay.
probably not standalone retail or I don't know, maybe I doubt if it's a standalone restaurant or anything like that. It's probably something that's going to be kind of part and parcel.
Okay, Mr. Simons?
Just to confirm agreement with all of that, some of the views were attributed to Tarmac, and those which were all correct. The idea for a community hub, which includes a sort of community hall, village hall style facility, potentially with a cafe as well, is exactly what's envisaged. In circumstances where Inspector, as you'll know, because you know the site very well by now, that the homes within the reduced version of the scheme, the 600, or we'll come to what the capacity is later on, are only a short walking distance to the Highlands, and well located with respect to Welwyn and all of that. So we say, we agree with what the council said on that, and we can also confirm that that is the deliverable iteration of the scheme. Mr. Thornley talked about whether or not it would be economically supportable to put a full set of retail and all of that into the smaller version of the scheme, and it that's not the way that we've analysed it. With the smaller version of the scheme, it supports a community hub, and that's what we're offering in an agreed location, I think, with the local authority as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Could I just say that those of you that have been following other aspects of the examination will no doubt remember that there was a long debate at Woolmer Green for the site that was being proposed there about provision of a shop. I think that was for 300 dwellings. Whilst the examination has been proceeding, the council lost a planning appeal for a redevelopment of a vacant industrial property. And that planning permission actually had a requirement to provide a shop. The development is approaching completion, believe it or not, and it has got basically a large sort of building which has got a shop, and I think something that probably would have a cafe or something in it. And the shop's occupied by Tesco. And, you know, I visited it on, what was it, Tuesday, as I was passing. I mean, it seems very successful. You know, despite lockdown, it had got, you know, quite a number of people in the middle of the day shopping in it. I don't know whether such a facility is appropriate or feasible at Birchall Garden suburb. I did actually walk to your new shopping centre, or it's not the new shopping centre, the place where people would have to walk to. I'd suggest that most people living on Birchall Garden suburb would not walk, they'd go in their car, or else they go somewhere else in their car. I don't know, maybe it's something you might want to look at, because it does seem to me that if it can work in a place like Woolmer Green, it ought to be able to work here. Mr. Boyd.
Morning, sir. Thank you. John Boyd, JB Planning Associates, representing Gascoigne Cecil Estates. Sir, I mean, we've been quite neutral on this point of the neighbourhood centre in our representations, but just to build on what you just said, I think at this early stage in the planning process, I think we should be a bit more aspirational about whether there should be any shopping facilities. I mean, clearly the council have got a view about viability, and so has the promoter, but they haven't put any evidence together to say that nothing could be provided. And you provided a very good example there in the Woolmer Green development. I mean, clearly it would add to the sustainability of the allocation of the development if there were some shops, and I'm sure the county highways would have a view as well about the ability to internalise some trips if there was some facilities locally provided on the site. And that could be a very relevant consideration when the planning application is prepared and transport assessments are being considered. So I think the point really is, should we be a bit more aspirational with this revised allocation? Thank you.
Mr. Thornley.
Thank you, sir. I mean, I think it's tempting, but I think probably misleading to try to compare retail facilities within edge of town or town locations with those in villages. The villages, particularly the larger villages around Welwyn Hatfield, are extremely well provided for by retail facilities, certainly compared with many other parts of the country, certainly outside the southeast, where you would struggle to find anywhere with more than one or two shops, any village with more than one or two shops. Woolmer Green, as it happens, is relatively, or previously relatively poorly served by retail facilities. I've got a list here of the most recent survey, and it suggests that there's takeaway, a vet, a bridal shop, a beauty salon, and a pub. So in terms of Woolmer Green itself, you could certainly see that there was a potential gap in the market there for a well-stocked food shop. Tesco obviously can provide food at reasonably lowish prices for local shops. And not surprising that it would be quite well served. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that Woolmer Green is on a main road, relatively busy road at least, and therefore is going to catch that passing trade, which is quite important for some of these shops, people going to and from work or other trips. Whereas a shop within the Birchall Garden suburb with a single access, single vehicular access at least, I think is not going to catch any passing trade. So I think they're probably, there are clear distinctions between the kind of the point you've made, which is a fair point, and the situation where we are at Birchall Garden suburb, which does have reasonable range of facilities, including non-retail, medical and so on, within walking distance, 1,200 meters or so. So within walking distance.
I take your point about not being a main road, but remember Woolmer Green is pretty close to Nebworth, where there are a lot of facilities. I mean, it's got a very good centre to it that must bring certainly people from Woolmer Green to it. Most people, I suspect, don't walk because it's a bit beyond the reach of most people walking. But I was surprised, A, to see it occupied by Tesco, and B, to see the number of people that were using it. But anyway, I don't want to get bogged down in that. I've just made the point. Mr. Simon.
Always on mute first. Just to add to what Mr. Thornley said, we've got some guidance, as you know very well, sir, from the things like the manual for streets as to what's walkable, and we're certainly well within that here for the Hall Grove shopping, including a co-op, well under half a mile away. And of course, remember, sir, a pedestrian access is part of the proposed scheme in the allocation. And remember also, another thing that Mr. Thornley didn't mention was, of course, there's a proposed large community centre in the wider BGS scheme, because although that we're focusing on our side of the line, it's coming forward as a whole, as an integrated single scheme, and that's how it'll be delivered. And on the East Hart side of the line, large community centre, which itself is going to include retail along a main road frontage. So that, sir, if there's going to be a Tesco, if you like, or whatever it ends up being, that could be where it ends up, and it could be much more sort of sustainable and economically viable for whoever the operator ends up being. But we don't think that on this side of the line, given the proximity to Welling, that there's a need for new retail within our site itself.
Okay. Item B, school site. David Locke were advocating that the school really shouldn't go into the site anymore, that the existing school on the edge of the commons should be extended. Are you still of that mind? Is it Mr. Winterskill who's going to talk on that?
Sorry, yeah, that's me as well, sir. So we're moving to school on the agenda, sir. Sorry, just trying to keep up. But yeah, good. All right. There's a similar position in a way for the as for the retail situation, in that there's no evidence, we say, that's before you now to support the provision of a new school as part of the scheme, rather than a contribution to extend the existing capacity. So our starting point, sir, is that, as you know, submission version of the plan gives us 1,200 dwellings on our side of the line, if you like, our side of the district boundary, together with a 2-form entry primary school. Now, the council's proposing that allocation be halved, but it still proposes that the allocation should provide that same school, even at 600 units. Now, there are 5 existing primary schools within a mile from the edge of our site, with a current capacity, I'm told, of some 150 places, 39 of which are at Commonswood, which, as you know, is literally, it's right there opposite our site. Further 14 schools beyond that, between 1 and 2 miles, with a further capacity of several hundred places. So, I mean, we think that there's almost 500 places in terms of spare capacity and excess capacity of a 2-form entry school. The policy for the BGS within the East Harts plan, adopted plan, is for 1,350 dwellings, together with the provision of a 3-form entry primary school. So there's that to consider as well. When you add all of that up, where we get is that there was a justified need, we say, for a school site in the submission version, but the significant capacity, both already and also capacity to extend the existing schools through contributions. The given future planned provision within the scheme itself, the broader BGS scheme on the East Hart side of the boundary, and the absence of any evidence before you, the whole point of today is to scrutinise whatever evidence there is and to support a school in respect of a smaller scheme, and I've still not seen any yet. We're just genuinely not aware of what the need is or how it's computed or evidenced, because it hasn't been. Of course, a proportionate contribution towards existing schools would be part of any scheme, so that's not what the argument's about. And just to say, just so you're aware, we've been trying to engage with the Education Authority on this for several months now, trying to work out where they're coming from in reference to conversations. But that's where we're at. And in the end, if there's no evidence, it shouldn't be part of the policy.
Well, perhaps Mr. Prietti will tell us what the Education Authority's views actually are.
Yes, thank you, sir, and good morning. I think the first thing that I'd say, just in response to the very last point that was made, that, and I'm going to say allegedly contact has been made with us for a couple of months trying to understand. I'm not aware of these emails. I'm certainly aware of emails that we have sent and been in contact with the developers and Welland Hatfield to try and understand the indicative level of the growth proposed, so that we could sufficiently understand what that level of need is. We haven't had anything back from them. I would like to see these constant emails from a couple of months where we have been requested information and evidence on this.
Well, let's not get bogged down in protocol. We need to move on and sort it out. I mean, 600 dwellings are proposed at the moment by the council on the site. I mean, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. If that was the sum total of the new housing, what is your view on the schools in the adjacent parts of Welwyn Garden City being able to accommodate the number of children it would generate?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with, we're not necessarily considering this site in its isolation. It's part of a strategy for Welwyn Garden City. Our understanding is that although there's been a change in the distribution of dwellings across Welwyn Garden City and a proposed reduction at Birchall Garden Suburb, the total level of growth proposed is still broadly the same. Therefore, the County Council's position in terms of requiring previously 9 forms of entry of mitigation across Welwyn Garden City remains the same, and this still includes a 3FE primary school at the East Hart side of Birchall Garden Suburb and a 2FE on the Welwyn Hatfield Borough Council side of it. I think I'll then say that furthermore, due to its size, Birchall Garden Suburb can be considered as a strategic development site of now proposed to be nearly 2,000 dwellings. The draft Birchall Garden Suburb policy of SP19 explicitly states that the site will be planned to create a new sustainable community incorporating Garden City principles. The on-site primary education provision, as currently set out, ensures that Birchall Garden City is a sustainable community. This is both in terms of movement, but also crucially in terms of the key role that schools play in developing and engendering a sense of neighbourhood and community cohesion, e.g. creating a new sustainable community. It's not clear how, without retaining the on-site primary education provision, as required as part of the Welwyn Hatfield Borough Council part of Birchall Garden Suburb, that the development will continue to meet this policy requirement. In addition, 700 dwellings, as being proposed by them if the school site is removed, would generate almost 1.5 forms of entry of primary age pupils. That's a significant level of pupil yield not to be mitigated on site. We'll also draw comparisons to probably the Panshanger site, another significant urban expansion of 650 dwellings, which is required to contribute a 2FE primary school on site. So I think for those reasons, and I'll come on to the reasons of capacity and existing schools in a minute, but just for those reasons, HGC considers that the level of primary education provision required for Birchall Garden Suburb should remain. On the point of surplus capacity, firstly, the GP data for the number of 0 to 4-year-olds living in Welwyn Garden City indicate a close match between demand and capacity. There's some outflow of pupils from the town to surrounding Welwyn villages at the moment, and this shows up on the capacity as there being some limited spare primary education capacity. However, when the proposed new dwellings in those other areas come forward, there'll be a pushback of pupils back to Welwyn Garden City, and therefore there will not be the surplus capacity remaining, e.g. that surplus capacity won't be there. It's also the position at present, without the significant levels of growth proposed for Welwyn Garden City as a whole being factored in, which includes those at Birchall Garden suburb. At the point in the future that children start to rise from this development, factoring in the time required for a planning application to be submitted, for it to be determined, for construction to start, and then housing to eventually be occupied, there is no guarantee that this spare capacity will still remain, and therefore for prudent planning, the level of mitigation for Birchall Garden suburb as set out should remain. To cover the point about existing capacity, very specifically, Commonswood Primary School has been referred to, and its ability to expand by one form of entry. This is incorrect. As the County Council stated in our previous Reg 19 representations, for this expansion to take place would require the Woodside School site as well, alongside the Commonswood School. Given that the Woodside Centre site has now been put forward for a special school, which is due to open in 2023, the option of expansion of Commonswood School is no longer possible. So that cannot be relied on to be expanded and therefore to mitigate these children arising from Birchall Garden suburb. I'm interested in this evidence as of existing schools having the ability to expand within statutory 2-mile walking distances of this site, because the information that we have is that any expansion of schools in Welwyn Garden City is in excess of 2 miles from this site, and therefore those children would not be walking to those schools. So just to conclude, the level of development still proposed for Birchall Garden suburb, the need to create these sense of communities, to engender new communities, the fact that there isn't the surplus capacity which has been referenced, and the fact that there is no ability for close schools, primary schools, to expand, means that the education provision currently proposed at Birchall Garden suburb should remain.
Okay, I'm not sure why you think that this is like a separate community and shouldn't in any way be integrated into the neighbouring parts of Welwyn Garden City, particularly if we're talking about people from this community having to go into the adjacent parts of Welwyn Garden City to do shopping and go to the doctors, etc., etc. You know, the school is an integral part of, you know, that community, and it could be an integral part of a wider community given its location. But I take what you say. All I would ask you now is then, assuming this development goes ahead, and it's a school site, you would definitely take the site over, and there will be a school there that you would maintain in perpetuity. Or is there a get out of jail clause?
Yes, we would progress with the school site at that location. In terms of perpetuity, there would be, I'm imagining that there will be some academy process, etc. But yes, it would be a school site. There is a strong evidence of need of that 2FE school site on the Welwyn Hatfield side of Birchall Garden suburb.
So there's no chance 5-10 years down the line you're saying, I'm sorry, we don't need the school anymore?
Based on current information that we have, that is the case.
But if information changes, then that could happen.
Well, I guess all information could change in the future. We don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know if there will be a significant major event which wipes out half the population, for example. Who knows what will happen? No. But in reasonable, I guess in reasonableness, we don't see that information significantly changing such that that school wouldn't be needed. I guess what, I mean, there's 5 FE being proposed over the 2 sites. We don't build schools of 1 FE, so it might be that we bring forward the East Hart School as a 2 FE in the first instance, to have a 2 FE in the Welwyn Hatfield part, a 2 FE in the East Hart part, and see if that additional 1 FE expansion of the East Hart to take it to 3 FE is required in the future. But as a starting point, we would see that there is that strong need for two FE primary schools within Birchall Garden suburb.
Okay, Mr. Simons, do you want to come back?
I know lots of hands are up, sir, so I'll just be very brief because I've said most of what I wanted to say. But you'll remember, just my final sort of gambit was to say, well, if there's evidence, let's evidence to support need for a new two FE school as part of the 600. Let's have it, and then we can obviously scrutinise it. That's the whole point of today. And I'm none the wiser after that disposition from Mr. Proietti. I don't see where the evidence is to support the 600. One of his points seemed to be the idea that the level of growth now proposed was broadly unchanged from what was previously proposed, taken as a whole. Well, it's a matter for you, sir, but I do struggle with that a little bit, because obviously we are talking about, on our side of the boundary, a very substantial reduction from the submission version of the plan. I don't see the evidence before you to support the contention, and that's what they need. It's not on us to justify this plan, it's on the local authority and the educational authority to support what they're after. The evidence before you to support the contention that the local schools can't be expanded, and indeed the idea that when we already know that a 3 FE schools going in on the other side of the district line, to say that, well, maybe we'll only take two of those possibly in the short term, and then have 2 on the other side of the boundary and see what happens, and maybe only use the rest of it if and when we need to, is unnecessary. What it speaks to is a lack of evidence to support the 2 FE on our side of the line. But anyway, that's it, sir. There's just no evidence that you've got to support this part of the council's proposed allocation.
Did you want to come in now, Ms. Tiley?
It was just a comment on overall levels of growth in Welwyn Garden City. The submitted local plan has total allocations of for Welwyn Garden City of 5,328 dwellings. With the additional sites coming forward in Welwyn Garden City, that brings the number up to 6,811 dwellings. So actually, whilst not on this site, numbers are going down. Overall in Welwyn Garden City, numbers are actually going up.
Okay, thanks for that. Mr. Davis?
Thank you, sir. Ian Davis, Central Hearts Green Corridor Group. The group just wished to raise the question about the actual location of the school within the development, and to remind you.
Can we just finish on the need for it, first of all? I presume Mr. Boyd wants to say something about that.
Okay.
Coming in a minute.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I just really wanted to say that the estate supports the Borough Council and the County Council in their endeavours to secure a 2-form entry school on the revised allocation. I think it's absolutely a requirement based on not just the obviously numerical figures and the evidence which the County Council has just very briefly outlined to you, sir, but also, interestingly, not mentioned by Mr. Simmons, the overall sustainability of the development. I mean, clearly, it's much more sustainable to have primary schools located on development sites within walkable distances. And I think Hearts County Council have obviously made that point probably more eloquently than I have just now, sir. But I believe that's a very strong driving factor that this allocation in its revised form should have a 2-form entry school. In relation to chopping and changing forms of entry between the East Hearts part and this part, sir, I think it's important that there's flexibility for the County Council to decide on the best way of delivering the education requirements to this new part of Welwyn Garden City. And if it's better to have a 2-form entry school on the East Hearts part and 2-form entry on this part, sir, I think that's perfectly reasonable. So really just to say we support the proposal as it's put forward. Thank you.
You had your hand up a moment ago, Mr. Proietti. Did you want to say something? Oh, you've got it up again now. Yeah.
Sorry, sir. Yeah. The point that I'd just make is that, yes, whilst the numbers are going down for this part of the site, if we look just at Birchall Garden suburb as a whole, it is still almost 2,000 dwellings, which is generating 4 FEs worth of primary education need itself. So there's a clear need there for at least 4 FEs need just for its own self to mitigate. And therefore, as I've said, if there's 2 FE on the Welland Hatfield side, 2 FE on the East Hart side, and then for prudent planning, retaining the ability for the wider Welland Garden City for that East Hart one to eventually maybe be 3 FE, then that represents what we believe as good, prudent planning. So even though the dwelling numbers are going down, there's still, even just looking at Birchfield Garden suburb, that 4 FE primary education need on site.
Okay, well, without going into a lot of, complicated calculations, is it possible for you to do something akin to what, I don't know, you personally did it, or someone in your department certainly did, a very useful analysis in the context of Welland Green, Brookmans Park, a little while back, as to, where children were coming and going from now and where they could come and go from in the future? I think it would probably be helpful, and it would just, well, prove you're right or not, or otherwise. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, location then, Mr. Davison, what did you want to say about the location of the school?
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to refer to EX227, the note from the council, which continues to show the school as being located quite close to Burnside, and to particularly remind you, sir, about the EX157, the noise assessment that was conducted for around Burnside, and the fact that a substantial part of the mitigation of the noise was due to take place by the construction of 4-storey blocks of housing, which would effectively be acting as a noise barrier. Well, if that noise barrier is no longer there because the southern section of the site is not going ahead, then is the proposed location of the school really a suitable one from a noise point of view to be providing a primary school? Should it be somewhere else within the site?
The noise barrier is still going to go there, and there still needs to be some visual barrier to protect the development on the southern part of the reduced site from the wider greenbelt. So it could go there, but from the point of view of being most convenient from the overall position of the community, somewhere nearer the centre would probably be more appropriate. One thing that somebody may be able to answer for me, which I wasn't sure about, to what extent do the non-building part of the school, the playing fields, etc., need to actually come within the housing allocation, or if the actual school was located on the eastern edge somewhere, are there parts of the former tip that, if they've not already been reclaimed, could be reclaimed, and the playing fields could go on that? Anyone know? No. Mr. Thornley?
I mean, I'm not going to put myself forward in any way as an expert on contamination or reclaiming land, but I would be surprised if the county or an academy school were willing to take formerly contaminated land as part of a school site where you're going to have children there all day.
Yeah. So just building on what Mr. Thornley said, it may be, sir, it goes back to what my initial, the point that I made right at the outset about, the potential flexibility benefits of allocating the entirety of the land. You've got those southern fields that you've given a view about in your interim findings, but it might be when we start thinking about playing fields in respect of the school, that at least some of them could be, or part of it could be located in some of that land. And so one of the benefits of, of removing the entirety of the allocated site from the greenbelt, even if it doesn't all go, even if the southern fields are excluded from any housing development, might be that kind of flexibility in the way the school's located.
Yeah, okay. It's just a little bit remote from most of the sites.
Sure.
Anyone else got any comments on that? No. Gascoigne and Cecil raised the issue of the extent of built development. Do you want to explain where you were coming from, Mr. Boyd?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah, we've tried to be entirely consistent in our approach to looking at Birchfield Garden suburb, and that goes back, sir, right to the Regulation 18 consultation stage in March 2015. Where we were very clear in saying that the extent of the of any allocation at Birchall Garden suburb should be to the north of the Holwood High Brook, hugging really the existing built-up area of that part of Welwyn Garden City. And we followed that line through, sir, through into the Regulation 19 representations we made in October 2016. And our view really hasn't changed. And obviously, you know, sir, we've participated in the various hearings that you've held.
I don't subscribe to that view, and I've stated my position on that. And unless we have exceptional circumstances that require review and the sort of thing that, you know, Mr. Simmons was talking about earlier, I'm not revisiting it.
Right, sir. Well,
the site that's in the interim report, and that's what we're talking about this morning. Not whether it should be as big or as that, or bigger or smaller.
Right. Okay. Well, so we don't agree with the site that's been identified, as you know. We still believe, and it is part of your Greenbelt question as well, that there isn't a good, solid alternative Greenbelt boundary as defined by the council in the area they've identified. We can't understand the logic of it going further south than Holwood High Brook. We agree with you that the school site is in the wrong location. It should be probably further north, and it should be further away from Burnside, which has caused a lot of problems to Tarmac in the promotion of their site. And we've obviously been there, we're not going to discuss that again. I think there are some landscape points, sir, which I'd like my colleague Michelle Bolger to inform you of as well, if that's okay. But I think, obviously, I don't want to go over old ground. Clearly, that's not what we're here to do today.
I think Ms. Bolger's on mute, Inspector.
Thank you.
Hello, Michelle Bolger, landscape architect, representing the Gascoigne Cecil estate. And just to say that I've been working with the estate for the last 5 years on this and all the other sites within the local plan that the estate is, where the estate is the promoter. Just to say that the proposal that's been put forward in EX227 still has a number of problems, and one of them clearly is the relationship between the development and Burnside, because in the latest information that was sent from Tarmac, this still isn't resolved, how the junction between the housing and the Burnside development is going to work. The proposals that were put forward, which involved 14-metre high barrier walls or 4-storey development right at the furthest edge of this development, the sort of the bit that's most adjacent to the wider retained green belt, and the fact that, you know, it's creating a very narrow corridor for any sort of pedestrian access between those 14-metre high buildings or barrier and the 10-metre high bund with 12-metre high planting on top of it is very unsatisfactory and is unresolved, and we didn't have any kind of detailed plan showing how it was going to be resolved. So that's one issue that this new proposal hasn't resolved. The other one is that the Holwell High Brook is now pretty much subsumed by development. We've got 2 roads crossing it, sort of at the northern end and at the sort of at the northeastern end and at the southwestern end. We also are going to need some sort of pedestrian crossing across it, where the green corridor is incorporated. The idea that the green corridor is going to allow movement of animals and people freely. I know we're coming on to the green corridor later, but the proposal as put forward doesn't, there isn't an easy solutions to how this will be achieved. And the only thing that's noted within that area on the roads is a bus priority lane, and it's not clear how that's going to assist in the green corridor.
Okay, thank you. So density capacity has been raised by David Locke Associates and Ian Davis. Did you want to say something to start with, Mr. Davis? I mean, what's the Green Corridor's concerns about the density capacity of the site, other than in the context that you'd like a bigger Green Corridor?
Yes, sir, noted. Simply that the design principles which have been stated as being applied as a matter of policy to Birchall Garden suburb all the way through have been those of Garden City, and in the policy it stated that as you move away from the edge of the developed zone of the city, the density would reduce, and the proposals as they stand now seem to be that the density is increasing on the edge of the city.
I don't think the proposals that were notionally put forward about 4-storey buildings next to the aggregate recycling centre are actually a part of the examination information. Certainly, the local plan will not be adopted referring to matters such as that's a matter for development control somewhere down the line as to, you know, what the actual distribution of mix of dwellings is on a particular site, not for the local plan, unless there are extremely good reasons why, you know, one should interfere there. I don't think that applies here personally. Is there anything else you wanted to say about it?
About density development, no, sir.
Okay, Mr. Simons.
Thank you, sir. Our starting point is, and I know you've heard this point before, but it's an important one. There's a really powerful imperative if you're going to release greenbelt land at all, anywhere as we are through this plan, to do it efficiently. And that sounds so obvious that you barely need to state it, but it's important because the idea is to reduce the extent of land that you need to release in the first place. What you do release needs to be used efficiently, effectively, all the rest of it. Now, applying what we would say for a site like this on the edge of a major settlement is a modest density of 35 dwellings per hectare across the entirety of the built site. The capacity of just this northern area is 770 units. That's without the new 2-form school. If you include the school, see the debate that we've just had, it goes down to 700. That's the capacity applying 35 dwellings per hectare. Now, our short point is there's no good reason, there really isn't, to artificially limit the capacity of a site like this, a strategic release, to 600, as the council's now seeking to do. They do it by applying a density of 30 dwellings per hectare rather than 35. So that's the extent of the dispute, if you like. In this context, we say that is too low. It's too low. The council accepts it's conservative, quote unquote, and you might think, oh well, perfectly sensible thing to try and be is conservative, but actually it's too conservative to maximise the efficient and effective use of this site, which is obviously a really important imperative of government policy. So actually, by trying to be quote unquote conservative, where it takes us is a real risk of using the site that we are going to release, the extent of land that we're going to release, ineffectively and inefficiently, and that would be run really directly contrary to what the government are telling us to do in the framework.
But does your density include assumptions for a green corridor, which most residential developments of this nature wouldn't have?
Yeah, the answer, yeah, and we'll obviously come to the green corridor and I think there's that next on the agenda. But yes, we say that 35 dwellings per hectare. For we're not out in the remote countryside. We're on the edge of a major settlement, one of the top tier settlements in the plan. 35 dwellings a hectare across the piece, if you like, as an overall average is a very, it's sensible. Going much lower actually creates problems for us in national policy terms because we start to use land inefficiently and ineffectively, and that's really important when you're talking about greenbelt releases, because the starting point is that they've got to be exceptional. That means when you get around to actually doing it, you've got to make sure that you use the land adequately.
Okay, thank you then. Yeah, Mr. Thornley.
Thank you, sir. Just to clarify the density numbers we're talking about. We're talking about net density on the site. So as I understand it, tarmac, and certainly in our case, when we're talking about 30 dwellings per hectare or 35, that is on the developable part of the site. It excludes the green corridor, the stream, the buffers, the community hub, the buffering around the edges, and in our case, the primary school. Obviously not so much in tarmac's case. So the difference is 30 to 35 net rather than gross. So I don't have a gross figure, but it's probably more closer to 20 or so.
Okay.
Across the whole site.
So have you used 30 or 35? Or
we have used 30.
Sorry?
We have used 30, and as has been pointed out, we've suggested that's probably a conservative estimate. Tarmac are suggesting 35, which obviously adds 100 onto the overall capacity of the site, given the 20 hectares of net developable area. I guess our view is, given delivery test issues, we don't want to be in a position where a site comes forward at 50 or 100 below what we're assuming going forward. But nevertheless, obviously, there's an element of truth to what Tarmac is suggesting, that equally we don't want to be under cooking, if you like, the potential of greenbelt sites when we are looking at exceptional circumstances and the need to release greenbelt land. So it is a difficult balancing act. We're broadly happy with our approach to it, but equally I do see some point in what Mr. Simons is saying as well.
Are Homes England going to be making the same points about Pantanga this afternoon?
Homes England are suggesting a slight increase in capacity, a smaller increase in capacity compared with this change, but on a smaller site. So I don't know whether the percentages would be different.
So I mean, have you used something like 30 across the board as a net density?
The general approach has been to use 30 to 50, depending on the location, as a net density through the HELAR, through the housing employment land availability assessment, which has obviously been updated various times. That has a net density of 30 to 50. The gross density varies because with the size of the site, you have more larger sites tend to have more non-residential development on them, primary schools and open spaces and what have you. And then that has, on a sort of site-specific basis, been tamped down sometimes where you have areas of floodplain or areas of buffer zones to ancient woodland and so on, which don't particularly apply. Well, there's an element of that in this site, which is around the local nature reserve, which has been excluded again from the net developable area. But yeah, generally that has been our approach as a sort of relatively consistent approach across the piece.
So how would this compare with North West Hatfield example?
I don't hold that figure in my head. I imagine that the gross North West Hatfield obviously has a secondary school in it, which is obviously
I mean,
much bigger.
We're talking about net density. So you take the area of the secondary school out, or you take the area of the green corridor.
I'm afraid I can't give you that answer.
All right. Well, I'll just ask you to go back and touch base and see whether or not you think they have a point. If they don't have a point, they don't have a point. But you need to be consistent throughout the different sites, don't you?
I mean, we've attempted to be consistent, but taking account of local conditions. I don't think we haven't applied a standard rate across the whole plan. We've applied a standard rate as amended to reflect local site requirements on the basis of sort of professional judgment. But as I say, I need to find out the Hatfield, Northwest Hatfield figure for you.
Right. Mr. Boyd.
Thank you, sir. Just to help you on North West Hatfield, it's around 28 dwellings per hectare net. Obviously, we do feel there is some capacity to potentially increase that. But I think the point I was going to make in relation to a general point on the allocated sites, but obviously it's relevant to this discussion on Birchall, is that I think it's sensible to not over-egg densities and capacities at this stage in the process. I think as a general principle, that can only really be determined at the planning application stage. I think the Borough Council probably accept that point as a general principle. So I wouldn't necessarily be suggesting to you that you should be driving up the densities at this stage in the process. I think 30 is a reasonable assumption. And of course, the application would have to be supported with a lot of further technical detail, which will then justify the proposals, whatever that density might end up being. So, and part of that assessment is obviously to consider a housing mix, an appropriate housing mix, and not to over-densify different parts of the site which might have more landscape sensitivity. I don't know whether Ms. Bolger wants to add anything to that on the landscape point of view, but that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Simmons.
Just a couple of very quickies, sir. Mr. Thornley talked about a sort of broad range of net densities being applied across the piece, if you like, between 30 and 50 dph, depending, as he said, on site specifics. If that's right, and it'll come back to us on the site that you asked him about, sir. But if that's right, putting this site edge of what a top tier settlement in the plan strategic allocation part of an overall, as I've said several times now, integrated strategic release, putting that right at the bottom of the council's range, it just doesn't stack up, not in a month of Sundays, for reasons that I've already explained. So I won't go on about that, but I mean, there are clearly you need to be putting this closer to the middle, however close. It's a question for the council's judgment in the end, but much closer to the middle and not at the bottom of a range of net densities across Welland as a whole. The second point to make is just very briefly in response to the idea that density, and Mr. Boyd's idea that density, why are we talking about this now? Shouldn't it all be left off to the development management process? Well, yeah, the detail, of course, will be part of any planning application. But of course, density is something you've got to think about because it affects capacity. Because we know what our net developable areas are, but even going up from 30 dph to 35 dph takes your density up from 600 to either 700 with a school or 770 without. And it's important, obviously, that the policy language grasp the nettle of indicative capacities. So those are two things I wanted to say, sir. That's
Michelle Bolger's got a hand up. I don't want to be getting into the detailed development of this site. We're talking about allocating a site to provide a number of dwellings, not what the thing's going to end up looking like.
Yes, sir. I do appreciate that, but just coming back to it's sort of connected to the density, to the point that was made earlier about the 4-storey dwellings near Burnside, that's not being proposed as a matter of kind of like density or development management process. It's being proposed as a means of dealing with an issue which is there, and there has to be, which is the noise from Burnside, and there has to be a solution to that issue. So obviously it is something that needs to be considered as likely to come forward at this stage, because it so far is the only way of being the only solution that's been put forward to dealing with that issue.
Well, we have a solution, don't we? We have a 70-metre wide bund that's 10 metres high with trees on top of it, and
no, that wasn't sufficient. If you look at the noise diagrams, that only worked in conjunction with the noise diagrams. Presented a series of different options, but they all involved some form of 14-metre high built development in addition to the bund. The bund in itself was not sufficient.
Okay, but that's a matter for the council. I mean, I've gone on about the noise at this and a number of sites ad infinitum, but at the end of the day, the council knows, what the framework and BPG says about it, what the World Health Standards are, but it's a matter for them to decide, what they want to accept in Welling Hatfield. Not to tell them.
And the solution that has been come up with in order to resolve it is to have 4-storey houses on the edge of the development. So I think, given that that is the solution to the problem, that has to be accepted, that is part of what would come forward.
Possibly so.
Assumed, yeah.
Okay. But that's not, if you like, flowing out of the plan. That is a matter of how Welling Hatfield want to treat noise considerations. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, sir. Just to point out that perhaps Hatfield and Welling Garden City are not good comparisons in terms of dwellings per hectare, given that Welling Garden City is the second garden city in the country, and the policies clearly indicate from this all the way through Birchall Garden suburb that the intention was to work with that, whereas Hatfield is a much more dense development in itself.
Okay, well, look, there's a very extensive estate just to the south of where Pangsanger is now that must have been built over the last 20 years. Maybe somebody could find out what the density there is. It seems pretty typical of modern day Welling Garden City. And I would have thought, if Hatfield's not appropriate because it's, 2 miles away, then, maybe that would be. Ms. Tiley?
Sorry, sir. We have had previous discussions when we talked about at our stage 3 hearing session, when we talked about appropriate density levels for the borough as a whole. Policy SP9 refers to net densities of between 30 to 50 dwelling per hectare. And at those hearing sessions, I referred to development coming forward in Welling Garden City, which achieves those densities, both within the conservation area and outside the conservation area. Obviously, it depends on the type of development. High density, it doesn't just relate to the height of development, it also relates to the type of dwellings that are being provided. And certainly from the analysis that we've done, there is no reason why you can't have development which is in keeping with the character of Welling Garden City, which is at least 30 dwellings per hectare, if not higher.
So is that intimating that you may have just underestimated it a little bit?
Well, sir, I think this is a large site, so even within the developable area, you will have areas of open space. So we think it's better to take a cautious approach to ensure that we achieve a quality development across the piece. Sometimes sites come forward achieving high numbers, sometimes they come forward achieving slightly lower numbers, but it's a cautious estimate, as Mr. Thornley said.
Okay. Mr. Simons?
Just one very quick thing, so from me, the council, I understand, instructed Allies and Morrison to consider a SPD work, bringing forward the entirety of the. Thank you. I'm just being shown what it is. The entirety of the. Just one sec. Am I muting the speaker? Sorry, sir. Technical hitch. I'm hearing myself. There we are. The council's instructed Allies and Morrison to produce its SPD, which at the moment is considering the scheme as a whole as originally submitted, as I understand it, not the reduced scheme. But just to give you a flavour on densities, just on this question of densities, to sort of put it into context, they looked at local examples. That's exactly what they were instructed to do, as I understand, by the council, to sort of get a flavour for what densities were, representative and what assumptions they should be applying in the master planning work that went into the SPD. And the range that they're using goes, it starts really, most of the site is in 35 plus, and it goes up to 40 and even 45 around the denser areas. That was the work that Allies and Morrison were doing for the council. So I think what that might do, sir, if anything, is indicate to you that perhaps the council you know, as I've indicated right at the outset of this discussion, have undercooked an appropriate density for a site in a sustainable location as this one.
But does it really matter? I mean, if, you know, this gets approved and the plan's adopted and you come forward with a scheme and, you know, your designers have an excellent layout that achieves, you know, nearer 40 than 30, you know, from your perspective, does that matter? I mean, okay, the council have ended up allocating more greenbelt land than they needed to because of it, but I mean, is that really a problem?
Our problem would be, sir, if the way that the policy is framed ends up constraining an appropriate and effective use of this site through use of capacities in the policy language. So, for example, if my client come forward at, I don't know, 750 or whatever, and it's said in a world where a policy has been adopted that sets the capacity at 600, you know, you're overdeveloping the site. This was looked at by Inspector Middleton. He decided that a sound capacity for this site would be 600. How could you possibly, you know, go back on that when in fact, you know, if that would be a problem, because we'd then be in it might be alleged by some of the people on this Zoom call in due course that we'd be overdeveloping the site in a way that you'd never anticipated, sort of thing. So I think that's why I come back to the idea that it's quite important, actually, although I agree that detail of density and where it's laid out across the site is all a matter for development management, but actually overall net density is an important question for you, because you've got in the end to reach a view on you know what a reasonable capacity is for this site. And if it's 7 or 770 if there's no school, that's the agreed maths, I think, takes us to 770 if there's no school. That's a substantial difference, and it's worth you noting, because depending on what you end up deciding on phones, those sorts of numbers could matter. That's really why I keep raising, you know, can we get more out of these sites? Absolutely, well, that's quite so.
I mean,
that's the page that I am. That's where we're coming from, sir. What can we get more out reasonably? If you can get more out reasonably at 35 DPH, say, if you can get another 170 units or whatever, then I mean, that's what we should be doing at the very least. That's on the assumption that you're not with me that the sands have shifted so much that we need to actually reconsider the case for 1200. If you're not there, then at the very least, we need to be thinking sensibly about what we can do with the land that the council's now proposing to me.
Okay. Mr. Boyd, you got your hand up.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick point, really. The work that Allied and Morrison, which Mr. Simmons has referred you to, just for your reference, it's in the examination, it's examination EX201K, indicative density plan for Birchall. Obviously in there, the key makes it clear that the densities start at 25 DPH, and it's interesting that the density diagram shows that lower density around the edges of the residential development parcels, and going down towards Burnside. So it's difficult to sort of pick out the colours, but it's either between 35 or 40, the density, which may or may not be, you know, appropriate given the sort of evidence that you've already looked at in terms of the form of development around Burnside to protect noise screening, etc. So that's quite helpful. I mean, just finally, I think we are getting a bit hung up on this, quite honestly. But a serious point is that an extra 170 houses, which is obviously what Tarmac are promoting here, is quite a significant difference to what the council have put forward. And I just don't see that there's any evidence to support it, really, at this stage. They may well be right, but it will only be determined at that detailed stage of consideration of the application. I'm sorry, but I don't see anything which can give you any comfort now to say the capacity should be changed to 170 more than what is proposed. Thank you. Mr.
Beglan?
So yes, just coming back on some of those points. Firstly, the local authority plainly did use, it started with a standardised approach, but then looked at individual circumstances, including the circumstance of this site, and came to the views that it did. So that exercise has been done. Secondly, the representatives of the local authority have consistently reminded you that a cautious approach is being taken. And over the course of the plan as a whole, of course, that is a sensible way to approach this, because whilst we don't want to end up in a situation where we release too much greenbelt land, plainly we have to, during the local plan, ensure that we release enough, because we don't want to find ourselves back in another plan-led process sooner than we would otherwise need to be. So it's important to take that on board, and that we have correctly decided to use a cautious approach. Now, within that cautious approach, of course, the detail will be decided at the development management stage, and there may be some sites that come in above expectations, some sites that come in below expectations, and so we have to take the picture in the round. And of course, you started off this session reminding people that, especially where we are now, with the benefit of your interim report, it really is for people to show why the approach that's foreshadowed in that report is not a sound approach going forward. And so that's the way we ought to be considering these things. And lastly, you may recall that where the local plan text, which is what we're concerned with to get right ultimately at the end of the day, where it deals with these issues, what it refers to is strategic sites accommodating approximately a figure. So insofar as Mr. Simons is concerned about it being a cap, it's certainly not intended to operate that way, and the language is not in that form. So if it is the case that a higher density can perfectly properly and consistent with other policies be brought forward here, then the language of the strategic allocation won't prevent that from happening.
All right, thank you for that. Right, let's move on to Green Corridor. Like Mr. Davis, we've been here before, and I really don't want to go over the whole history of this. As I concluded last time, I've gone as far as I could go as far as making suggestions. At the end of the day, it's a matter for the council. But you're obviously still concerned. And, you know, since the last meeting, the council have, if you like, put forward more detailed proposals as what it envisages happening, linking basically the Commons Nature Reserve with the central part of the site. Now, you know, why is what that is big? Sorry, why what is that what the council is suggesting unsound? That's really what I want to know.
Thank you, sir. We welcome all of that. We particularly welcome the increasing detail that the council has offered up. Clearly, based on the evidence we've already submitted, we'd prefer to see a wider corridor, but we accept that there's a compromise on that. The major concern that we have, based on EX227, the note to yourself from the council, was the loop road crossing the green corridor and the potential impact on that on the functioning of the green corridor.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, does it need a loop road crossing it, or, you know, would it suffice with a section of what would obviously be a loop road around the site, being single road across the corridor? You could have it as a figure of 8, for example. Is that not acceptable in highway terms?
We would certainly argue that I was
looking for someone who, you know, designs highways or is responsible for the planning. So. You tell me, Mr. Thornley, you've got your hand up.
If you want a transport expert, you're probably better going to our transport expert in the room, who I can't see anymore, actually.
It's in the bottom right-hand corner on my side.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hello, guys. Yes, Anthony Collier, Herts County Council. I mean, there would be constraints in the design such as that, but you know, I think we're fairly flexible, and not being something that's often designed for significant consideration of things like green corridors, but it's not, wouldn't be undeliverable with a single point of sort of a figure of 8 configuration. I couldn't give you an answer on the impact of the green corridor, but I think, you know, there's a lot of flexibility in what could be designed on a site like this.
Yeah, I think what Mr. Davis is saying is we have, you know, you have 2 roads crossing this corridor. It's going to be more disruptive than 1.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the arbitrary number would be about 300 dwellings from a single point of access. So, you know, and that could be argued either way as well. But yeah, you could probably divide the site in half and put 300 plus over a single road.
Yeah.
Exception.
Okay, anybody else want to say anything about the green corridor? Right, we'll move on to Greenbelt boundary. Anybody want to say anything about that? Yeah, Mr. Simons.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, our starting point on the Greenbelt boundary, I know this is something this is something that you've heard before, but our starting point is the framework's requirement. It's in the current framework, but more importantly, it's in the 2012 version as well, in just the same language. You've got to define your boundaries clearly. You've got to use physical features that are readily recognisable and are likely to be permanent. That's our starting point. Those are the tests. Is it clear? Does it use a physical feature? Is that feature readily recognisable? Is that feature likely to be permanent? That's what we're after. Now, to state what might be blindingly obvious, the answer to those tests is the A414. It's clear, it's definite, it's a physical feature, it's readily recognisable, and it's likely to be permanent. And it's not just me saying that, sir. You can also take the approach from the council's consultants, LUC, and the doc reference for you, though you almost don't look at it now, but it's EX99 capital A as the LUC Greenbelt Study, March 2019. And when you get to that report, sir, it's page 26, where LUC consider the sorts of features that you should be looking for in order to, identify a boundary that meets those tests. And what they're after, they tell us, natural features like substantial watercourses, woodland water bodies, or man-made features like A and B roads. And the problem with less prominent features like hedgerows, tree lines, streams, ditches is that they're less permanent, they're less regular, and all the rest of it, less likely to be permanent in the longer term. So that's the first good reason for thinking about the road as our starting point for a permanent defensible boundary. But the second reason, so no, it's another important one, is that adopting the road as a permanent defensible greenbelt boundary has the benefit of consistency with the approach to the East Herts part of the allocation. Obviously, it makes no sense at all for the greenbelt, which of course is a strategic spatial level planning tool, for the approach to boundaries to be from arbitrary. It's essentially arbitrary which side of the local authority boundary you happen to be on. The approach at a strategic level should be the same to identifying greenbelt boundaries. So compare the approach that I'm urging on you, really, which is to take the obvious boundary of the greenbelt, which is the road. Whether or not either you could identify in the policy the southern area as an area where there's not going to be any built development or the rest of it. The greenbelt boundary needs to be the road, and you should compare what I'm suggesting and how that would look to the very odd approach with the respect that the council's now proposing. The very odd shape indeed, which is created by the council's proposed amended greenbelt boundary, which tracks our development area for part of the boundary, which is sort of fair enough, you might think, but it totally fails even to try to identify a permanent defensible physical feature, which we can already recognise in the landscape. And things only get worse as you start to move to the east towards the boundary with East Herts. And of course, and for some of it, of course, it tracks that boundary with East Herts, which is literally imperceptible on the ground. It doesn't exist as a permanent, physical feature or anything else that you might be able to see or recognize. It's a line on a plan, sir, and that's exactly what we're not supposed to be doing when we are trying to identify permanent defensible boundaries. Where the council ends up, it's a bit like one of those maps, those sort of gerrymandering maps in America, where you see, you think, how on earth has that shape been created? They've ended up with an irregular boundary, which creates an isolated area between the road and the edge of the greenbelt. And that isolated area served up with between the A414 and the greenbelt is just the kind of thing, just that sort of area of land is going to be the sort of area which in the next plan making exercise or the plan making exercise after that, there's going to be someone coming along and putting pressure on the council to release that bit of land from the greenbelt because it forms an obvious logical extension to the built development boundary. And that's the problem, because the whole point of this exercise is that you're looking for something permanent. That's the, goes back to the beginning. That's why we're at a permanent, readily recognizable physical feature in the landscape. Even if, sir, we end up with the 600 version of the scheme, or the 700 or the 770, and not the 1200, which I alluded at the outset, it's imperative. It really is imperative that the greenbelt boundary be something that's permanent, readily recognizable, and reflect physical features in the landscape. The answer to that's simple. The boundary has to track the road. Now, it just has to. There is no other permanent physical feature, which allows for a rational, sensible solution to this issue, and which delivers an efficient and effective use of the strategic site. And of course, that doesn't mean, it doesn't follow from that the entirety of that land has to be, given over to housing or whatever else, because you can identify through the allocation policy which bits of the Greenbelt release are for housing and which bits are, say, for landscape mitigation or whatever else it might be. So, sir, that's what we say about the boundary.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in what you say. I'm, not a great believer in having land allocated as Greenbelt unless there are really good, clear Greenbelt reasons for putting forward. But what I do find interesting is there is a finger of Greenbelt on the submitted plan between the western part of your site, north of Hatfield High Brook, and the common side. A long finger of Greenbelt. I mean, that must break every rule in the book you've just referring to. And yet, you never mentioned a word about it when we were discussing. We've had 3 previous hearings about,
right,
this site, and the Greenbelt's figured in all of them, and no one has ever mentioned that. What are the, what purposes does that piece of land serve? I know what you've said, but the PPG, sorry, the framework doesn't say that, the most important aspect of defining Greenbelts is to have, the most defensible boundary. There are other considerations.
Oh, of course, sir. Yeah,
all right.
I wouldn't seek to demur from that one bit, but of course, when you, nonetheless, when what we're after is a permanent release, that's what we're after. I mean, obviously, but things can always change down the line, but we're after a release that's not going to have to be revisited in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. That's the fundamental purpose of Greenbelt policies, is that when you release, you do it, as once and for all as you possibly can. So we do say that, albeit you're absolutely right, sir, to say that, boundaries is one part of that picture. It's one consideration. Actually, though, on this site, it's a really important consideration, because if you follow the council's line, as it were, literally and metaphorically, the council's line on the boundary, it's very, with the best will in the world, it's very difficult to conceive that this will be the last time this bit of the Greenbelt boundary is argued about, over the next decade or more, because it doesn't create something that's logical, rational, defensible. Now, to that extent, as you said, sir, it basically breaks all the rules in the book when it comes to how you define a permanent defensible Greenbelt boundary. And what it's really about, sir, is making this as much a once and for all exercise as we possibly can.
Yeah, point noted. Mr. Boyd.
Thank you, sir. We don't disagree with Mr. Simmons' point about requiring a defensible and permanent Greenbelt boundary. Clearly, that's an essential part of this exercise you're going through. What we say is that the A414 isn't that, though. It's a simple point, really. And we think it's a pity that there's no evidence before you, sir, to support the revised allocation in Greenbelt terms. I'm pretty sure, sir, looking back at some of your notes, you've asked for that in the past. So all we've really got from EX99, sir, the stage 3 Greenbelt study, is the parcel P24, which LUC defined. And although it's helpful in some respects, but obviously it covers areas much wider than just this this revised boundary. But when you look at the southern part of P24, so it's on page 1110 for your note of EX99, it clearly defines the parcel using the Holwell Hyde Brook and the River Valley. And I think it does that for a purpose, a reason, because it performs a very strong, defensible, long-term, permanent Greenbelt boundary. And that's what the estate says there. You've heard that from us before. But in concluding on the harm assessment on P24, on page 108 of EX99, LUC say, however, the wooded River Valley to the southeast of P24, i.e. Holwell Hyde Brook, contains the area from the wider countryside. And as you know, we've been very concerned about the open views and the wider countryside to the south of the 414 and containing any development at Birchall Garden suburb. And that's why we still maintain that the logical boundary would be the River Valley. It's a strong physical feature. You don't have to skip all the way to the A414 to get to a physical feature. You've got it there in front of you, sir.
If we had the greenbelt boundary there, half the development will be in the greenbelt.
Well, sir, we don't think it should actually go south of the...
I know we don't think that, but we've been there before, haven't we? You know, we're not really here to go back discussing all that. We've had 3 goes at it.
So I'm not trying to go back over old ground. I mean, we responded to EX227 and we set out our views as to why the greenbelt boundary should be where it is. I mean, we're not trying to argue any different to you today, sir, really. We still think firmly that that is the logical greenbelt boundary, you know, and it isn't the one the council had defined, and it isn't the one which goes all the way down to the 414.
But if that was a logical greenbelt boundary, then we would probably be talking about 250 to 300 houses here instead of 600 or maybe more.
If you look at the indicative density plan I referred you to, sir, you're talking about between 360, 370 houses.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Thornley.
Thank you, sir. Yes, clearly a boundary that reduces the site further, takes it further away from the sort of strategic extension that it was for Welwyn Garden City, and indeed takes it further away, one would argue, from being, you know, integrated with the East Herts proposal, which was obviously the genesis of the whole proposal many years ago. Looking at the greenbelt boundary, the criticisms that have been aimed at it by Tarmac, I'm not sure those are entirely fair. I mean, obviously we are working with an interim recommendation from yourself, which suggests an area which we've reduced to the allocation. The greenbelt boundary has to be, in our view, related to that particular proposal, and therefore the point that you make about your views about the importance of that area south of the north of the A414 and south, or including part of the former landfill as part of the wider greenbelt, must be reflected in any greenbelt boundary that we recommend to you, or else we are essentially ignoring your interim report. So given that constraint, given the area that we are proposing as reduced allocation, and also given the fact that we do have an adopted greenbelt in East Herts, which we're clearly not legally at liberty to amend, we're really not left with anything other than the greenbelt boundary we're proposing to you as a workable outcome. Clearly, we do accept that the eastern element of the greenbelt boundary, where it follows precisely the borough boundary, the East Devon, Welwyn Hatfield boundary, does not follow in all cases like anything on the ground. I think in one case it jinks through a wood, but there is nothing we can do about that beyond the proposal from Tarmac to take the greenbelt boundary all the way to the 414. There really is no other solution. Otherwise, we would be leaving a bit of non-green belt along the edge of a wood, or some other even more ridiculous, weird outcome. So our view is that given the constraints that we're working to in terms of East Herts and the area that you're pushing us towards allocating, and the removal of the chunk of Birchall Garden suburb that was in the submitted plan, really we're not left with any option other than the greenbelt boundary that we've suggested to you.
Is this a quick point, Mr. Simons?
Very quick, sir. It'll be 30 seconds, if that's okay, just in response to what Mr. Thornley said. I mean, I think that it sounds like to me, sir, from the local authority, that you're not really getting much of a defence of this boundary, other than to say it's the best that we can do given your interim findings, as if your interim findings, if the only sort of outcome from your interim findings is that the Greenbelt boundary's got to be drawn in this very strange way that actually nobody seems to support, even the council, really, other than them saying that, you know, it's the best we can do, it's the best of a bad lot. It does not flow, sir, and I don't need to tell you this because you wrote them, but it does not flow from your interim findings that the road is not a suitable Greenbelt boundary. It may well flow from your interim findings that you can't put, you know, the full 1,200 unit scheme can't be developed, including the southern portion of the site. That's what you found. Fine. When it comes to defining a sensible Greenbelt boundary, that's a different ball game. And as I've indicated 3 or 4 times now, it's perfectly possible to come up with a suitable, defensible, permanent Greenbelt boundary, and through the allocation policy, indicate what goes where. Doesn't mean that you're passing the whole thing over for development, which means it can be perfectly consistent and not inconsistent with your interim findings, sir.
Yeah, Mrs. Budger.
Just to say that we, as I think has been made clear before, strongly disagree that the 414 makes an appropriate Greenbelt boundary. Most roads are permanent, but it doesn't mean that they define the difference between the area where land is serving the purposes of the Greenbelt and those areas of land which aren't serving the purposes of the Greenbelt. And it's very clear in this location that the 414 enables, as you travel along the 414, you have an appreciation of the separation between the settlements. And that appreciation is very much to do with the fact that the land is open on both sides of the 414. So the 414 very clearly goes through the Greenbelt and has a role in going through the Greenbelt in allowing you to appreciate the separation of settlements. It doesn't, simply because it's a road and permanent, of which there are many, make it a good Greenbelt boundary.
Okay, no one else got a hand up. Before we leave Greenbelt, it's probably the opportune time to bring up the revised strategy plan that seems to still have a notation for some sort of screening bund adjacent to the A14. In view of the revisions, that is not appropriate. When I did my assessment and decided to do what I did, and this has really got a bearing on the area to the south of Hatfield Hyde Brook that is still proposed for development, I was convinced by the screening bond to the north of Burnside that was put forward by Jarvis's. And my opinion is, if that was continued across to the Copse, which is just a little bit to the east of the development site, the east of the development site, then that would screen the new development in the fullness of time, and not a fullness of time that, you know, is decades away from the wider Greenbelt. So I will be looking in the revised strategy plan that's actually inside the document for a proposed boundary screening mound with trees on it across the southern part of the site. I'd suggest you follow the northern boundary of Burnside across to the Copse, and then the development goes to the north of it. Mr. Davis.
So I agree entirely with you on that. I would only comment that it then becomes critical, given the substantial width of that screening area necessary, whether that is located inside or outside the Greenbelt release. And I have no strong views either way on that.
Well, we seem to have adopted a policy when we were talking about the Greenbelt a couple of weeks ago, that areas such as that would be in the Greenbelt. Mr. Thornley, do you want to say something about that?
He's on mute, Inspector.
You're not turning your microphone on.
Yeah. Apologies. It's a question to you, actually. Clarification, if I may. If you look at that area from, you've obviously got an option to put that bund either north or south of the existing hedged hedge line with trees. If you are following some kind of bund from Burnside to that copse, in terms of the health of that hedgerow, presuming that you want to retain it as having probably some wildlife importance, being a pre-existing hedgerow with mature trees in it, generally you don't want to put mounding too close to it, because that has the impacts on roots and various aspects of the trees. So can I ask whether you're suggesting that the bund should go south of that hedgerow and then jink up to the copse that you're talking about, the kind of liver-shaped copse, or if we're going north of the hedgerow, then obviously we are taking an additional slice out of the developable area and also going through the school site as well, which would have probably would have something of an impact on the capacity of the site.
I don't really have a fixed view as to where you really put it, except that when you are, if you like, walking in the area between the road from Essendon to West End and the A414, and you look across the valley, you don't see houses sticking up above it. Now, quite clearly, if you're going to be putting 3-4 story buildings quite close to it, then that has an implication on how high it has to be. But I mean, quite honestly, if you put a bund across there and it makes no difference at all to the perception of this area from the wider green belt, but then what is the point? Mrs. Bolger's got a hand up.
Yes, just on those 2 points that have just been raised. Firstly, I entirely agree with Mr. Thornley that given that there is an existing hedge there with mature trees, one would want to think very carefully about the implications for that, for placing a bund close to it. And that's not just a question of affecting roots and so on, but obviously changing the aspect of those trees. Secondly, I think it's very clear from the photo montages that have been prepared that actually the bunding in this area, even with bunding in this area, there is still going to be visibility of the development as it goes up the slope from Essendon, particularly the bit that's getting towards the as it were just below the green corridor as it's going further up the slope, that I don't think is going to be screened by a bund in that area. Bunds can in themselves be quite intrusive and can appear quite uncharacteristic as well in the landscape. So I think as a solution, it might in fact create as many problems as it might potentially solve.
Well, maybe it will, but I'm not going back on what I've written in the interim report, at least not for now. Okay, so you're not going anywhere. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, sir. Just thinking about your question about the what's the purpose of the bund if it were sited behind that hedgerow. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the main purpose of the bund was noise control, wasn't it, rather than screening? The planting that was going to go on the bund was the screening. So if you were able to thicken that hedgerow, then that would serve the screening purpose. But what it wouldn't do is shield the development from the noise from Burnside.
The western part of it is primarily to reduce the noise, but it also has a screening effect as well. The eastern part is really just for screening. And I don't personally think thickening the hedgerows enough. The land's rising. That's the problem. That's been the problem. I don't know whether people have had a misconception of what I said. I'm not concerned about dwellings that could have been built at the rear of a screening bund funding the A414. I went to see one at Hartford, and it has got its problems, but I accept that that could be overcome. It's not there. It's when you get further up the hill, you know, towards the tip or going further into the area south of Hatfield Hyde Brook. That's what you would see above a screening bund next to the A414, not the dwellings immediately at the rear of it. So, you know, we need a screening bund along the southern boundary of the site. Unfortunately, that hedge doesn't go in a straight line. It kinks around, but that's something for someone to look at in detail. Clearly, the further you can get it to the south, when you get in the context of the plantation, which it needs to link into, maybe there will be land that hasn't actually been tipped on and could be developed immediately to the north of it. I don't know, but, you know, the bottom line is it shouldn't be seen from the wider greenbelt. Okay, delivery. Mr. Thornley, when are you expecting this site to start delivering?
I think this is a site which probably could sneak into the 5-year supply, towards the end of the 5-year supply, but obviously it's likely to be most of it beyond then. So I think we're looking at something like 50 or 100 within the 5-year supply. I don't have our revised trajectory in front of me, I'm afraid. So that bit of a downfall in my research. Mrs. Tiley might have that in front of her.
I do indeed, and we're proposing, suggesting in the trajectory that we could have 50 dwellings in year 4, 100 dwellings in year 5, and then 125 dwellings thereafter until you get to the last 2 years.
Okay. Does anybody violently disagree with that, Mr. Simmons?
I don't know about violently, sir, but yeah, there's a bit of disagreement there because originally we were penciled in for, I think, what would be, if I've got this right, year 3 of the commencement in year 3 of the 5-year supply, which would mean 23/24, rather than the council now kicking us off in 24/25. Now the council originally had us in that 23/24 year. And we don't see the reason for the change, for pushing us back. There's no good explanation, we don't think, for deferring delivery until that year, when other sites like Northwest Hatfield, for example, are showing on the council's trajectory, are showing commencing dwellings coming out of the ground in 23/24 within the same boat, basically. And of course, as you'll know, sir, this is a site being planned strategically where there's an SPD which is going to come forward. Of course, SPDs themselves can take a bit of time, but the point of the SPD is to speed up delivery, not to slow it down. It's to, well, once you've got an SPD in place, the idea is going to be that it eases the course of an outline application. So there's every good reason to think that we would be, you know, moving quicker than the council currently has us.
Okay. We've got Miss Tiley. Do you want to respond to that?
Just to say that we also have Northwest Hatfield starting in years 4 and 5. The principle has always been that these large strategic sites will take a while to sort out outline planning applications and detail matters, and we didn't consider that we'd get any completions until year 4. So it's the years might have changed, but actually where it appears in the trajectory hasn't. We've always assumed these large strategic sites would only really be able to start delivering in the first 2 years of the 5-year period after adoption.
Okay, Mr. Davis and Mr. Boyd's got their hand up. Is this to agree with the council, or have you got something profound to say?
So I'm speaking very much in my own capacity here, not as representative of the Green Corridor Group, but having spent almost my entire life looking at the landfill site, I just question whether the proposed access road that's going to serve the site is running across severely contaminated land, and just how deliverable that road is and how much it's going to cost to deliver. I would point out that although I did get up onto the landfill site as a child fairly frequently, I very rarely went over to the back of the site, to the northern edge of the site. So I can't be entirely sure of quite how much landfill took place right over there on the route that the proposed access road's going through. But as a comparison, when the 414 was dualled from the Holwell roundabout to the East Herts borough boundary in 1977 and 78, it was built.
Tell me where all this is going and what relevance it's got to what we're discussing this morning. I mean, if you're trying to tell me that, you know, the site isn't implementable and it all should be taken out, look, we've been there before, and, you know, there isn't any evidence to suggest that it can't, you know, be developed.
Fair enough. Okay. But,
okay.
Okay. Yep.
Mr. Boyd.
Sir, you'll be pleased to know that we don't challenge the delivery rates, that they're absolutely fine with us. What I'd like to do through you, sir, is just seek a point of clarification with what Mr. Simmons said. I think he referred to the SPD needing to be prepared. Have Tarmac changed their position now? Because they were objecting to an SPD originally. Are they now saying, yes, they will be working collaboratively with stakeholders on agreeing an SPD? Because obviously we'd be very interested in that.
Mr. Simons, are you the best to answer this, or the council?
I might be. I'm happy. Well, certainly for our part, to the extent it was put to Tarmac, if you like, rather than to the council, then absolutely right. The initial position was that we didn't think we needed an SPD. However, it looks that ship has sort of sailed. Things have moved on, and not only are we prepared to work collaboratively in order to get one produced, that works, you know, well underway and has been ongoing, and Tarmac are doing it, are working proactively to try and get an SPD away. And just for a point of clarification, I've not got, I'm sorry to say, the document references on the Miss Tiley's trajectory, but it's worth checking, because what she tells us, and obviously we've got to take what she says, that the Northwest Hatfield site, although, you know, I said to you that that site is in for 24-25 and we're not. So I said that site's in for 23-24 and we're in for 24-25, and she said no, in fact the numbers are all these sites are tallied up together. I'm told that that's not correct. Need to check the documents. I've not got the reference. I think it's EX224. I've just been told, so I need to go and have a look. But Miss Tyler can clarify. Obviously, it's not the end of the world. But we do say that given the SPD to which we are actively contributing, that there's reason to be a bit more optimistic.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, could I just come back on that? Just to confirm, actually, I did misread the trajectory. Mr. Simons is correct. We do have this site starting in year 5. I am happy to bring it forward to year 4 to be consistent with the approach we've taken previously.
Okay, thank you.
I'm grateful for that.
Right, anyone wish to raise anything else? If not, that brings us to the conclusion of this part of this morning's hearing then. Thank you very much for your attendance. We've gone on a little bit longer than I anticipated, but not to worry. We'll no doubt make time up later in the day. To those of you that are going to log out and are not listening to Pantanger, then thank you very much for your attendance, and have a good day.
Thank you, sir. The
people that are staying in, please remember not to log out, but please, if you're wishing to stay in your room and you're wishing to have conversations with people, do make sure you've turned your microphone off, and probably your camera as well, for a good idea. And I'll reconvene at 11:45. The owners of the Lancaster North think that, if you like, some of their land should be considered, if not for development, at least to help facilitate improved capacity on the development site. And Mrs. Quinton's got concerns about the overall scale and intensity of the developments, if I'm right. So could I start by Mrs. Quinton and ask her to, briefly outline what her remaining reservations about this proposed development is.
Good morning, sir. My chief concerns are regarding how much green space is actually going to be left north of development. The Greenbelt part of this site was originally designed to be a biodiversity offset for the development on the initial phase 1 part of the site. That amount of space has now been considerably reduced, especially in the northern part of the airfield. It was also designed, I believe, to be a link between the green corridor, so linking the SSSI at Chewin to Panshanger Park and into the green corridor itself. That now is going to be a very thin path. I noticed Mr. Thornley mentioned that his standard tree belt last week, he estimated to be 15 metres wide. Well, at some parts, the space left behind is actually less than that. This whole area, well, I'll go back to the hilly fields part of the site. In fact, is currently used by the local population for dog walking. There are a large number of dogs and for other recreational activities. A large part of that will be built on, taking away that green space to be used by current residents and future residents. And the space that will remain is considerably less than already available, and I think will be insufficient for maintaining the health and mental sanity of people who want to walk around the area. I have a specific problem with the indicative master plan, which leaves a slot view towards Chewin and the church. I believe that the whole joy of that part of the world are the open aspects across the valley, which will be cut off by their master plan. So that's my second issue. And also, originally we were told that there might be 75 houses in this Greenbelt extension. Now, I do understand that there could be some softening of the Greenbelt line as it stands, but that softening shouldn't extend right up to the boundary of the site. The original 75 has now grown by an additional 90 in January last year, and now proposing another 30 in January this year. So it's gone from 75 to 195, which is a considerable difference and makes a considerable difference to the space that's taken up. And for that 195, even for the 75, there are no proposed affordable houses. The affordable houses that are proposed only relate to 650 on phase 1 site. And my last point, we were talking earlier about densities in Birchwood Garden suburb. Now, unfortunately, I can't put my finger down to the numbers, but I know that at some stage in the last 9 years, which I've been following this for, it was mentioned that the density of the housing immediately south of the airfield was around 27 dwellings per hectare, and to the west of the Hillyfield site it is slightly higher, so I would estimate 30 to 35. The current plans from Homes England are working with a 40 dwellings per hectare. Now that is a gross number. I believe, Mr. Jobbins can correct me if I'm wrong there, but that is a considerable increase from 27 to 40, and that 40 would have to be continued up to the edge of the development to fit the number of homes in. As the investor probably knows, the height of the buildings has been restricted by Heritage England to, in the main, 2 stories. So that density does not reflect a number of floors going upwards, it reflects dense houses on the ground. That's my starting point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Jobbins, what are the concerns of Homes England?
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Can I just clarify? Are we just dealing on your point-by-point basis, or would you like me to?
I'd like you to basically cover them all. I think we'll probably get through it quicker.
Okay, understood. Well, firstly, we're in a bit of a unique position, sir, as you'll appreciate, that we already have planning consent on the majority of the site for 650 dwellings. The land itself is in private ownership, Homes England ownership. In terms of the development itself, I think it's fair to say we are largely in agreement with the council. We believe the site can be extended. We agree in the main in terms of the development limits, if you like, except in relation to the eastern boundary. And we have a concern that the council are unnecessarily restraining or intentionally restraining the development potential of the site by a modest amount. So trying to deal with the points that were raised just now, like I say, in terms of the development itself, we already have a consent. We're looking to maximise the additional land to the north. However, that has, of course, to be commensurate with its setting and the greenbelt boundary. If I can be bold and to refer to your interim report, sir, you did refer to the northern boundary following the tree hedge line. And that's exactly what both the council and ourselves are suggesting is the correct approach. When it comes to the eastern boundary, sir, in terms of the greenbelt boundary proposed by the council, we have a strong difference of opinion. And I think if you were to look both at the framework and look at the evidence on the ground, the council is drawing a very tight line around a feature that doesn't exist. So we have a strong disagreement with that. And I'll come back in a moment to why that's constraining the development, if I may. So in terms of the overall development and the green space that's been referred to, we are in excess of open space standards across the site. And that excludes the ecological enhancement area. So we're still in excess of the public open space requirements. So I would disagree, I'm afraid, with Councillor Quinton on that point. In terms of the greenbelt and the protection of the greenbelt, we are proposing significant structural planting around the edges and the periphery of the built form, and that includes open space and structural planting. It is not, I appreciate the drawings are diagrammatic and illustrative, but it's not, to my understanding, 15 metres. It is considerably more than that in places. So again, I would have to disagree, I'm afraid, with Councillor Quinton's point on that. In terms of the structural planting, so we've looked at that from a number of aspects, including the views out and the views into the site. And again, we believe that that viewpoint across the church is important, and we think that's a positive of the site. And like I say, we've worked very closely with the council, and only last week had a very productive and positive meeting. So our differences really, sir, relate primarily to the location of the greenbelt boundary, and in terms of the quantum of development on the site. Now, if I can turn back to that point about the greenbelt, the council, I think, and I'm sure Mrs. Tyler will clarify this in a moment, are not using a physical boundary on the ground. That clearly doesn't exist. They are using an indicative master plan that was produced for the outline planning application. Moving on from there, obviously, we are now accepting that there is going to be an increase in gypsy and traveller provision on the site, as an example. And in retaining that line, which is somewhat out of date, I would suggest, it is unnecessarily inhibiting the location of some of the facilities within the expanded site. Our line, however, follows a natural and defined feature on the ground, which of course is compliant with the framework. And it allows us to look at a slight flexing of the uses in that area, which we do fully understand has to be open and kept open, which is why the school and the public open spaces are in that general eastern location. But the council seems to have omitted reference to the Gypsy and Traveller site entirely within its strategy diagram, sir. So what we're simply suggesting is that we should follow the line of the hedgerow to the east, that we can still put in a minimum of 30-metre landscape woodland strip along that edge, and that's that edge only, where it widens out considerably after that. But that gives us the flexibility to accommodate the requested increase in Gypsy and Traveller pitches. We're not proposing to change anything else in terms of the council strategy diagram. I would like to correct the point about affordable housing. We are proposing 30% affordable housing provision across the entire site. So it's certainly not the case that we would not be producing or providing any affordable housing in the northern addition. So just to hopefully reassure Councillor, it's a 30% policy compliant provision across the whole site. So there are a number of other things on your list, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but that's my initial sort of response. And again, just to reiterate, we've worked very, very closely with the council. And we've only got this, what I would call a minor disagreement in terms of the policy, but nonetheless quite important to us. Thank you.
Okay. Is it Mr. Briggs, the principal spokesman? Or is it Mrs. Osborne? Mrs. Osborne. Okay.
It's me, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, sir. We are happy with the idea of additional development on the drone, but as we've always been saying for the last 30 years, we do think that the structural landscaping belt is absolutely essential, or at least a structural landscaping belt to protect views of the Mimram Valley. And you said yourself, sir, a few moments ago at the end of the last session, development should not be seen from the wider green belt, and that is a fundamental concern of ours. When the previous inspector who first released this land on the drone for development was looking at this in the late 80s, he, like you, walked all the local footpaths and came to the view that the existing development from the opposite side of the valley is a long, straight, harsh, and largely unrelieved skyline feature. And I believe that is still true. If I don't know, sir, you said you walked the footpaths, whether you walked FP 18, which runs the immediate south of Marden Hill. If you walk along that path, which is essentially an east-west route, to go just beyond the house and then look across, you can very clearly see the edge of the existing housing. Now, what is being proposed now is not only bringing the housing very much closer to that edge, but not providing the wide green belt, the wide structural planting that the previous inspector thought was essential. So we're now being hit in two ways. We're being asked to provide a lot more development within the site, and also not provide the structural landscaping in advance of the development, which was something else which the previous inspector was very concerned that should be happening. So when I've looked at the original proposals map that came out in 1992, it seems to me that having measured, I appreciate that you can't measure too accurately from these drawings, but at the eastern end, the structural planting belt was about 200 metres wide. At its narrowest point where the land of the drone joins Berrycock Green, it went down to about 50 metres, but thereafter it opened again up to about 100 to 250 metres. I agree with the councillors. I think now the hinge point does come down to about 15 metres. In other places, it's down to about 50 metres, and we simply don't think that that is adequate. And particularly when my client's land exists, is on the same level as the structural planting that is proposed on the remainder of the drone and could be used to provide a significantly thicker belt of native tree planting, which would be good in both landscape terms and, of course, in carbon terms. So that is our fundamental concern in terms of the visual impact of the development.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, going back to one of Mrs. Quinton's first points, from what's been said, there's more than the requirement for public open space within the residential development. Is that right, Ms. Tiley or Mr. Thornley, whoever's dealing with it?
Thank you, sir. If I pick up on that point, that is my understanding, although the meeting Mr. Jobbins was referring to was with colleagues in development management, but I know that they don't have any particular concerns in terms of the direction the master plan is taking in terms of the provision of open space. And of course, quite a large part of the site is left undeveloped. Particularly that closest to Hilly Fields. The part closest to Hilly Fields, the only part being released for development is the safeguarded land, for which outline consent already exists. And then the extension to the allocation in the submitted plan relates more to the land which was previously used as the airfield. Whilst the boundary doesn't follow a precise physical feature, it does relate to detailed considerations that outline planning stage in terms of a landscape framework and protection of historic or heritage assets in the Mimram Valley and Marden Hill, and from the footpath that Mrs. Osborne was referring to. So that's why we've ended up with the line that we have, following the approach that we normally take, that green planting, buffering should be out, should be within the green belt, and the line does identify the extent of built development. With regards to the greenbelt boundary to the east, that reflects the considerations set out in the Pansanga Park and Environment Heritage Impact Assessment, looking at impacts of potential development both in East Herts and Welwyn Hatfield. The document is in the examination library, Sir HIS 3, and that identified that the eastern part of the site should remain open. This is discussed particularly in paragraphs 4.112, 4.113 and 4.114, which all talks about the importance of or the potential impact to the significance of Pansanga Park and the need to keep this part of the site open, sir.
Okay. Going on then to extent of built development and protection of the wider green belt. On Tuesday afternoon, I did walk some of the footpaths around here, and I did make a point of going to Chewing Church, and I can recommend anybody to go there. The view is really nice. If you stand on the south side of Chewing Church and you look across at this site, you see quite strong landscaping on the eastern part of the northern boundary of the site, and you do on the western part. You don't see any development in Welwyn Garden City at all. Look straight ahead of you in the middle, you actually do see the existing Pansanga development, filtered a little bit by the trees, and okay, it's well, it was March. No, it was February. It's not at the best time of year, but you could see it. I don't see any reason why the landscaping in the Central Park can't be bulked up to a point whereby if I was to come back here in 10, 15 years time, assuming I'm still alive, I wouldn't be able to see the existing development, let alone the new one either. And I feel like in the same way as I was wanting the wider green belt at Birchall Garden suburb screened from the development, I think it's perfectly feasible, probably easier here to achieve it. Walking around the site, I didn't really feel that the boundaries that were on the plans that the council resubmitted actually reflected the southern edge of the existing landscaping areas. And there were, particularly in the centre of the site, areas which could be considered. Now, I don't know what your proposals are for open space and whether they're peppered around the site or whether they're all in one area next to the northern part of the site. But if they're peppered around the site, then there's no reason why development can't go further north to compensate for it. The other point that I didn't really follow, which Ms. Tyler can probably answer in a minute, is when you get to the western end of the site and approaching the lane whose name escapes me that comes out of Welwyn Garden City, there's a belt of trees which takes off from that road, and then it goes around a bit of a bend, and it hits the area, where the footpath comes down from Welwyn Gardens if you're going north. Now that seems to have been left out of the site as far as development is concerned, or as far as anything's concerned that I can see. Now I don't understand why that's the case, because it seems to me that that belt of trees is a logical northern extension. Doesn't need anything doing to it. You can't see anything behind it when you stand outside Chewing Church. So there may be good reasons, but I'd be interested to know why development isn't proposed there as well as on the eastern side of the site. I know what Ms. Tiley says about the nearby Panzanger Park. However, I would point out that heritage assets don't have to be protected per se. You're meant to assess the value of the heritage asset, and we'll no doubt get onto that this afternoon, and that has to basically be weighed against the benefits to the wider community of development. Now, whether that's been the case or not, I'll have a look at that. But again, it seemed to me that Panzanger Park has got a field between it and this site, so it's not actually blurring with it. You know, there's a clear distinction, and if there's an adequate belt of planting on the eastern edge of this site, then I don't see what the impact on Panzanger Park will be at all. But there we are. But if the council could clarify what the position is with the area on the sort of northwestern corner of this site, I'd be interested to know.
Well, it was shown on the original strategy diagram as a proposal to maintain the existing trees. I don't, and that was certainly something that, in terms of assessing the impact on biodiversity and ecology, that was seen to be something desirable, but I don't think it has any specific intrinsic wildlife site value other than its amenity value. And there is a change of levels there as well, which would need to be addressed. And that there hasn't been any sort of disagreement or any approach to include that area in the site area. So I can't really add anything more than that.
The only reason I'm raising these sorts of things is you seem to be struggling for sites or for land to make up your numbers, and it just strikes me in that context, anywhere that isn't actually likely to offend planning principles, then, you know, really, at least if nothing else, it ought to be looked at. So I would just point out, I mean, I'm not suggesting for a minute that you should get rid of any of the trees or anything, but there does seem to be that the actual boundary of the site, as originally put forward and as now put forward, doesn't seem to sort of tie in with the actual development boundary that you've put in, and that's the position there is obviously the position at the eastern boundary of the site, because you mentioned that, and there's also, I think, a section in the central part of the site. If you look on the original strategy diagram, you do actually have a sort of boundary map on that, and that to me is almost exactly where it ought to be for the most part. You know, I don't see that as being unsound, with the possible exception of the sort of area where it juts down to the south at the western end of the site, when you probably need to follow where the existing belt of trees are.
So perhaps I can add to the issue here. I mean, you're obviously quite right. The Greenbelt boundary, as we are now proposing it, whether you wish to look at the revised strategy diagram or in the EX225, which is in plan 3, or plan 2, which is the revised Greenbelt boundary on a more detailed map, either will do.
So yeah, in front of me, yeah.
Yes. So if you're looking at the plan 2, then you've got the blue, which is the existing, or the submitted site, if you like.
Yeah.
We're not proposing any change to, if you like, that western L-shaped bit of the submitted site, northwards. That's largely bounded to the north by an existing sort of triangular shaped wood, which screens it very well. The bit that we're changing is obviously what was the relatively the jinked but straight line, the 2 straight lines that were formerly was the greenbelt boundary, and we're proposing to extend it out with that wiggly line, which you quite rightly described as not following anything particularly on the ground existing. The reason for that shape is that it reflects the inward extent of the agreed biodiversity offsetting stroke net gain that arose from the existing planning permission. So if you go on that same document somewhere, yes, plan 1, which is at the bottom of it, which is on page 3. Page 3 of the same document, EX225. Plan 1 is an extract from the planning permission, and it is 2018-0873, and it is the plan which one of the conditions in the planning permission relates to, or refers to, I should say, and it shows the extent of the biodiversity enhancement area across the sort of northern end of the plateau, I guess. And you'll see that the inner line of that, hopefully, is reasonably closely related to, and in fact it should follow exactly, the outer line of the green belt in the plans that we looked at earlier. And that's deliberate. We are of the view that having a planning permission with a specific requirement associated with it for biodiversity net gain, I think it is, it would be inappropriate for us to then propose to extend built development into that area and clearly therefore undermine the ability of the existing planning permission to meet that net gain area. So that's why it follows what is there currently no distinction on the ground, but clearly as that net gain is provided, which will include trees and other forms of planting, as you can see, various types, wildflower meadows and so on, that will then become a fairly distinct and indeed I would suggest attractive edge to the development as we are currently proposing it. So that's the, if you like, the genesis of the greenbelt boundary along the northern edge. Now, I think you were referring to a tree line that kind of takes that an upside down L shape, if you like, just to the north of the sort of western end of the extension, if you like. Mm-hmm. And as you can see, that is part of that biodiversity net gain area. And therefore, from our point of view, not something we would wish to see developed. To do so would either reduce the net gain overall, or would act to would then require Homes England or Homes England in this case to find other land elsewhere on which to carry out that net gain. So that's the reason. We did have a Wildlife Trust objection when we consulted on the proposed extension back in January, February last year, and we did persuade them to not withdraw their objection, but that the proposal was not going to impinge on the net gain area. That was the basis of their objection, that they would be losing the already agreed net gain from the planning permission. So that's the basis for the northern greenbelt boundary. Obviously, Mrs. Tiley has explained the eastern one, which is more related to heritage rather than net gain. So if we were to extend the built development into part of that, I think we would have to then, whether through the local plan process or outside it, work out the implications of that for the existing planning permission and where biodiversity enhancement could take place, presumably within the ownership of Homes England.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be advocating that you necessarily, forgot about your biodiversity. It's really, a matter of whether or not that, in the context of your extreme difficulty at finding land for a number of houses you're supposed to be providing, that what's come forward is the best solution. But that's really a matter for yourselves and Homes England to discuss between yourselves.
I'm not aware that there's a difference in view on this particular boundary with Homes England, but I may find out differently in a moment.
Okay, Mr. Jobbins.
Yeah, can I try and assist? Excuse me, sir. I'm just going to race back to the point about the open space, just to confirm that, because I didn't get the opportunity. But even if you discount the ecological area that we've referred to, we're still 1.7 hectares in excess of the council standard. So I just wanted to make that point. I couldn't make it earlier. In terms of the council's approach, and I commend the council for many of its aspects, but it appears to be too wedded to a outline planning consent for what we term phase 1, and it's not really giving us the opportunity to convince, let's say, the council that actually the increase to 845 dwellings on this site can meet all the technical requirements. It can meet and exceed the public open space requirements, and also it retains the ecological area that has been discussed. And in no way does Homes England want to water that down. But what we do want to do is twofold. One is make the most efficient use of this site, because we all agree if we're going to release greenbelt land, it should be used effectively. And secondly, they're very, very keen on placemaking. And that's why the master plan has had a lot of detail thrown at it to hopefully convince the council. Now, I happen to agree with you, sir, perhaps not unsurprisingly, that I think that the structural landscaping that we are showing will be very, very effective. And it's certainly Homes England to front load a lot of this infrastructure, and it's in a happy position to be able to do that. So I don't share any of the concerns that the council has, but I do have concerns that it's unintentionally restricting our ability to deliver good placemaking. And if I can just very briefly, because I've already touched on it, the Gypsy and Traveller provision, sir, we're being asked to increase that from 6 to 12, which we can do. But because of the understandable desire to have the access on close to the Panshanger access so that the larger vehicles can get in and out of the site, by retaining the greenbelt boundary the council is currently showing, it is basically pushing the Gypsy and Traveller provision further into the site itself. And that has implications in terms of traffic and movements of vehicles and a conflict with residential property. And that's the point that the council's development management colleagues fully accepted and could see the wisdom in what we were proposing. So, I'm struggling to understand the greenbelt boundary and the council's approach to it on this site. And equally, I'm struggling to understand why it feels it has to follow that boundary when the Panshanger Park itself, as you rightly say, the setting, it's protected not only by potential landscaping, but also by the fact I think we've got the dimensions, it's like 250 metres, that field, before you get to Panshanger Lane. So I would contend that the boundary of the greenbelt, if it's on our line, would still allow plenty of mitigation should it be necessary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Quinton?
Yes, I'm surprised that the Herts and Middlesex Wildlife Trust actually agreed that the biodiversity offset is sufficient. looking at the portion on the northern side of what was the airfield, it seems that you've got hay meadows mixed with low planting, mixed with landscaping, and I would be very surprised if that all thrives. It doesn't seem to me that it's adequate biodiversity offset for the site as a whole, because the diversity on that site, when it was an operational airfield, when it was as it is now, is has a lot of wildlife and sort of plants and stuff, and it seems an inadequate offset to me. But my other point I wanted to come back to was, in fact, the linkage of the green corridor from this site, from Panshanger through to Panshanger Park and through to, excuse me, the green corridor that would go through the Birchall Gardens suburb part of Welwyn Garden City, and where that linkage is going, because I'd see no attempt to make a pathway or a pleasant link along the northern side of that development.
Anybody able to answer that?
So, apologies, but I'm struggling to understand why it wouldn't be a pleasant walk. I mean, I'm looking at our indicative master plan or concept plan, sir.
Yeah.
Providing, obviously there's walks and tree-lined avenues through the development itself, which follows the line of the runway, which we feel is a good from a heritage aspect. But looking at the northern boundary, there's significant areas, in my view, of open land planting. Plus, there's now this central wedge, if I can call it that, or corridor through the centre of the site. And I can find nothing unattractive about that. And also, sir, the experience is kinetic or dynamic. You will have open land to you, which you will appreciate when this development has been built. That's not, that will still remain open. So again, I guess I'm disagreeing with the point about it being unattractive. I can see nothing unattractive about it.
Okay. Ms. Osborne?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I agree with Councillor Quinton on the point about where the proposed footpath is shown around the periphery of the site. We could offer a far more attractive solution if the path was moved further northward. There is an existing very serious problem of trespass. At the moment, people walk north along FP 62 until you come to the right-hand bend, and then, so if you look at the concept plan, there's a short stretch where it goes west to east. Then instead of turning north to go down to the B1000, which is where the official route goes, people just cut across my client's fields, and they're breaking down fences, and it's happening all the time. They go out there and advise very politely that, no, this is private land, you shouldn't be doing this. But nevertheless, people still on a very regular basis do it. And I'm quite convinced that that is going to get much, much worse if we have 800 plus houses built even closer. So what our suggestion is, and this is shown on the drawing that was prepared by the Landscape Partnership, which is at my appendix 04 to my submission last year, was that part of our land is used to provide a continuing eastward link from the east-west section of FP62 to link through to FP21, which already cuts through our eastern fields. And then FP21 in turn, as it heads south, leads to Panshanger Lane, and then that will lead directly into the existing pedestrian and cycle route into Panshanger Park, which will soon be opened up to traffic as well. So that could provide an extremely attractive route along the edge of the development with wonderful views across the valley, which is going to be far more attractive than having to walk through a residential housing estate.
Anybody got any observations on that?
I guess me again, sir. Sorry. I'm just not getting it, I guess. You're not going to be forced to walk through what I hope will be a very attractive residential estate. There is very generous structural landscaping, public open space. We're looking at the detail now. It is generous in its widths. I don't agree that the 15 metres is not a figure I recognise anyway. The minimum on our drawing is 30 metres. It widens out to 80 in places. in my view, it'll be a very, very attractive walk, sir, around the edge of what hopefully will be an attractive development fronting onto that space, which will give it that natural surveillance as well. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, going back to the wildlife offsetting, is there any scope to move some of it off site? I mean, I'm mindful of the commons, which, you know, I know a lot's gone into that, but it's effectively a wildlife area that is next to a residential area at the moment. It's going to be sandwiched between two residential areas if the plan comes to fulfillment. There's already considerable trespass into it by, you know, people walking dogs and dogs running loose, children clearly playing there, looking at the number of rope swings that you see dangling from trees, etc., etc. From a wildlife perspective, that can't be an optimum site. It just can't be. And I do wonder, you know, given the proximity of you large areas of wildlife offsetting you're providing next to your residential areas, so if, you know, 10 years after this is built, you won't be in the same situation. You know, wildlife areas and you know, regular public use, be it for children playing, walking dogs, etc., just don't mix. You know, you can never have an optimum wildlife site when you've got that sort of juxtaposition between their locations and, you know, large numbers of people living.
So I think you're absolutely right. Homes England does own land in the vicinity of this site, and there are other opportunities or options anyway where we could relocate some of the ecological enhancement area. That's clear. And if we were being encouraged to look at some further land, I can assure you there's no technical risk. So from a highways perspective, and I'm staring right at the Hertfordshire Highways chap, but from a highways perspective, drainage, etc., there are no technical constraints to increasing the numbers beyond the 845 we're suggesting. I know I'm probably raising a few alarm bells with the people around the room here, but certainly Homes England does own other land in the vicinity of the site where it could consider relocating it.
Okay. Mr. Thornley?
I mean, just a general point in terms of local nature reserves. They're not designed to be only for nature. Local nature reserves by definition are for access to nature by residents. And so I think you need to look at the commons in that context. And I think equally you would need to look at the potential the biodiversity offsetting area here also in that context. The concept of green infrastructure is multifunctional uses so far as you know the particular circumstances allow.
Yeah, I'm not for a minute suggesting that the Commons is wrong. I take my hats off to what people must have done there to achieve what they've got. But, you know, the evidence that the Wildlife Trusts have been putting before this examination is that it's much more than that, that it's actually critical that there's links from the northeast into it so you can get movement of species, etc., etc. And, you know, I was told, you know, rare birds, etc., wouldn't come to it unless things were changed. Whereas, you know, my bird's view at the moment is, you know, you can put all the corridors you want into link to the Commons and it will never be outstanding. It can't be because of the amount of trespass that's in it and the conflicting uses of it. I mean, it depends what, you know, your biodiversity offsetting is about. If it's just about providing local nature reserves for teachers to take school children to, then that's one thing. If it's something, you know, where we're actually supposed to be enhancing the diversity of nature, you know, well, I question whether large areas next to residential development are the most appropriate places for them. But anyway, Ms. Tiley.
Thank you, sir. I just simply wanted to add that I know when the outline application was originally submitted, there were concerns expressed from Natural England, and that was because of potential impact on Chewinbury SSI, which is in East Herts to the north and quite close to this site. So I think they would have concerns about the offsetting moving further to the south, and what they'd actually be looking for is a sort of a resource which helps to protect Chewinbury SSI to the north of the site, and it would need to be looked at in that context. That's not to say there aren't other solutions, but the Commons may not be something that they would be happy to agree to.
Yeah. Mr. Thornley?
Yes, apologies. I missed my main point. by diverting onto the commons. There is an issue with the borough boundary here, which I know we shouldn't be too concerned about, but it does strike me that it becomes quite difficult for a local plan to require infrastructure or enhancements or whatever off-site and outside the plan area in associating with the site. So that would be something in relation to the additional land being suggested by the adjoining landowners. I think that would be something that you would need to consider in your under delivery.
Yeah, I mean, you quite clearly couldn't be proposing houses or anything. I mean, I do notice on the strategy diagram that's in the current local plan that your landscaping barrier, whatever, on the northern side actually does go outside the borough boundary for a stretch of it. But I mean, it's greenbelt, and you can plant trees in greenbelts.
I'm not sure it does. There's certainly the red line site boundary does go outside, but I think that really just reflects the ownership of Homes England.
Oh, does it? All right, it's not following the borough boundary then.
The borough boundary is the black dotted line.
All right, apologies. Okay, yeah. All right, I've got you. Yeah, okay, so it wouldn't. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. All right, anybody want to say anything else about that, or are we concluded? Ms. Osborne?
No, I think you're right, sir. I'm looking at the strategy diagram, and there are definitely places where the landscaping is shown to the north of the borough boundary line, which would imply it's on my client's land. Yeah, and as I said, we don't have a problem with that. But more than, we are perfectly amenable to talk to Homes England about these issues. It's just very disappointing that so far they've refused to engage with us.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on. Neighbourhood centre. I picked up that various people had issues about that. Does anybody wish to say anything? Presumably, Mr. Jobbins. You need to turn your microphone on.
I knew it'd happen. I knew it'd happen one day. So under the current outline planning consent, the local centre was shown to the east of the site, if I can call it that. And if you were to draw a 400-metre walking, cycling arc, you wouldn't be capturing the maximum population. So we suggested that it would be far better, more centrally located within the allocation, and you would therefore capture not only existing residents, but also the new population, or much more of it. The council agreed with that proposition happily, and equally Hertfordshire Highways, who we had a meeting with last week, agreed that it would reduce the desire for people to drive because they'd have the facility more on their doorstep. And so the location of it, I believe anyway, is agreed by all in terms of it being a betterment to the consent that currently exists.
Okay, thank you for that. Does anyone have issues on density? No, okay. I'm presuming you're going to provide 30% affordable housing. So really, although they've been raised in representations, well, there's nowhere I can go with it if you're meeting what the local plan standard is.
I generally don't understand where that concern has come from, but I can, as I said earlier, I'll reassure you it's 30% policy compliant across the whole site.
Right, okay. Provision of public open space, we've touched on it. I mean, I take it that it's captured around the development by and large. Is that a fair assumption?
It is. I mean, again, we've applied the council standards in terms of leaps, neeps, and play areas, etc. So it's spread around the development as you would expect, I hope.
Okay. And lastly, delivery. Maybe the council could tell us when they're anticipating development to come out of this site, and to what extent is it contributing to the 5-year supply?
So this was the line I read for the previous session. So this is intended to come forward in years 4 and 5, and then thereafter.
So how many does it deliver in year 4, 5?
Let me just, so it's, sorry, I've got the wrong document up on my. So it's in year 4, it's 50. In year 5, it's 100 dwellings, and then 125 after that, until the last 2 years when it's 1975.
Okay, do you concur with all that, Mr. Jobbins? You need to turn your microphone on.
I don't believe it. Sorry, I do apologise.
It happens.
So we are preparing the reserve matters application for the Spine Road, which is already consented, and we are very keen to progress the site. So I would agree. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Right, does anybody want to raise anything else? Okay, all right. I would ask you to get together. As I say, I mean, this is the 6th local plan examination that I've done. It's the only one when I've, been really concerned about people using every scrap of land to provide development and, to get more houses. But there's an obvious reason for that, and it's really the only reason I'm raising it. So I will just ask you to look at whether or not you are maximising the development potential of this site without sacrificing planning principles to achieve it. Okay, because it wants to be a good development, and the residential area next to it, I will go and live there, and it needs to be as good as that, if not better. And I can't see any reason, why it shouldn't be. You've got a beautiful flat site to build on, and you couldn't have a better site for building on. And there's no reason why it can't be excellent. But as I say, if it's possible to look at the areas, I'll have a separate look at the area on the east, and I have looked at the Pansanga Park assessment, but I'll look at it again and see what it says and come back to you on that. But if you can increase the developed area either on the extreme west of the site or somewhere in the northern part of the centre without, reducing your ability to screen the site from the north, then really the opportunity ought to be taken, unless the council are suddenly going to bring lots of new housing sites out of the rabbit hole or wherever and suddenly meet the need. Okay, but with that, if nobody wishes to raise anything else, thank you all for attending, and I'll see some of you again at 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.